From Westminster, Sir Keir Starmer has officially become the UK's new Prime Minister after a landslide victory for Labour in the general election.
Whether you voted Labour or not, in fact, especially if you did not, I say to you directly, my government will serve you.
Sir Keir entered Downing Street just over an hour ago to cheers from his supporters, promising change would begin immediately. Earlier, he met King Charles at Buckingham Palace, where he was formally invited to form a government. We'll be watching who is coming and going as the new Prime Minister chooses his cabinet.
For the Conservatives, it was a night of pain with an historic number of seats lost. As he left Downing Street for the final time as Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak said he had heard the anger of voters.
I am sorry. I have given this job my all. But you have sent a clear signal that the government of the United Kingdom must change, and yours is the only judgment that matters.
As the former Conservative Prime Minister Liz Truss and a record number of senior politicians lose their seats, Rishi Sunak says he will soon step down as party leader, but not immediately. Celebrations for the Liberal Democrats, returning 71 seats, becoming the third largest party in the Commons.
In Scotland, the SNP are down to just 9 MPs, losing dozens of seats to Labour. The First Minister says it has been a tough night during a difficult period for his party.
Nigel Farage is elected as an MP for the first time on a night which saw Reform UK take over 4 million votes. We're expecting to hear from him very shortly.
Good afternoon and welcome back to Westminster, where it has been a dramatic 24 hours in British politics. Sir Keir Starmer has made his first address as Prime Minister from Downing Street, and he declared that change would begin immediately. His Labour Party has won an historic victory in the general election with a majority of more than 170 seats. The Conservatives have had their worst ever defeat, with just over 120 seats remaining.
Well, we're right by the Houses of Parliament this afternoon, and we're going to hear from more politicians, old and new and very new, experts and advisors who will be looking back at an extraordinary night. And we're also looking forward. What happens next? Overnight, some of the most familiar faces in British politics have lost their seats, including the former Prime Minister Liz Truss, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Grant Shapps, Penny Mordaunt. When they come back here to Parliament in the next few days, this place is going to feel and look very different indeed, isn't it?
It certainly is. Well, we are going to be live in Downing Street throughout the afternoon. Sir Keir Starmer will start very shortly, we think, appointing his cabinet. We're also going to hear from presenters across the UK in Glasgow, Belfast, Cardiff, and we're going to hear from voters as well across the UK. Wherever you live, however you voted, whatever you think of the results, we're going to guide you through everything as it unfolds today. Let's go straight to Downing Street. Laura Koonsberg is there for us now. And Laura, give us a sense of what will be happening in the next hour or two.
So Sir Keir Starmer has undertaken the most formal bit of the day, going to the palace to accept the invitation of the King. He's then had his victory lap here in Downing Street when he arrived to the jubilation of, 100 or so supporters who'd been carefully choreographed to be here to cheer him as he arrived with his wife. Huge hugs, celebrations, and the odd tear being wiped away. He's given his first speech to the country. But the next part is absolutely critical. So, Keir Starmer, he's a huge football fan. Imagine he has a football team that's just had its biggest promotion in history. Now this afternoon, in front of all of our eyes, he's got to select the squad. Now, the expectation is absolutely that he will stick very closely to what's the shadow team. So those ministers we've been used to seeing on the airwaves, the shadow chancellor, Rachel Reeves, we very much expect her also to be moving into Downing Street into number 11 here. His deputy, Angela Rayner, somebody beloved by the Labour membership, we absolutely expect her to be becoming the Deputy Prime Minister, probably taking on responsibility for housing. Same with Wes Streeting. He's been a prominent voice in this campaign, talking about how he wants to get the health service back into shape. Absolutely, we expect him to be walking in and then walking out with a smile and a new job as the Health Secretary. However, overnight, there were two surprises for Keir Starmer. One huge shock, where Jonathan Ashworth, who had been one of his really prominent members of his shadow cabinet, he, in a surprise, lost his Leicester seat. Less of a shock, but still a real eyebrow raiser for the Labour Party. Thangam Debonair lost her seat in Bristol Central to the Green Party. She would have been expected to become the Culture Secretary. And with those two out, that does give Keir Starmer a bit of flexibility to be able to move in some others who perhaps he might not have this morning, or until the early hours of this morning, expected to be appointing to his cabinet. But John and Sophie, the whole process can, in Westminster style, end up going a little bit awry, because this is a huge operation. The big famous cabinet names are the people who will be appointed first, but actually what's known as the government payroll, all of those government jobs, is about more than 100 in the end. So behind me in the building, it'll start off orderly. We know that Keir Starmer has been preparing for this very carefully for a very long time. I'm sure he prepared and thought through every single step on the journey from the car to the door of Buckingham Palace, as we're just watching those pictures again now. But the cabinet appointments should begin shortly. We've been told to expect the first one really any moment now. So we'll give you a shout when we spot the first person. We expect it to be Angela Rayner walking into Downing Street. She will have the expectation of becoming the Deputy Prime Minister, maybe in a few minutes.
Laura, you shout, we will come running back, Laura. We'll see you shortly.
Well, we're joined here in the studio by Ian Hislop, who is editor of Private Eye, and also by Harriet Harman, the former Labour minister, who was an MP for 42 years, mother of the House. And you went through that very process that Laura is talking about back in 1997, didn't you? What was it like?
Well, I think some of the Cabinet will know that they are going to have their positions. So I think Rachel Reeves will know she's going to be Chancellor. Yvette Cooper will know she's going to be Home Secretary. David Lammy will know he's going to be Foreign Secretary. Bridget Phillipson will probably know she's going to be Education Secretary. But for the others, they won't necessarily have been told what their role is. And what will happen is they'll be at home and they'll wait for the phone to ring. And in fact, when it happened to me, it was the old landline. So one of my children picked up the phone, which means it must have been on a Saturday. And I was told it was number 10 down the street. So I thought, how nice of them. They're ringing up to congratulate on a Labour majority. And then I realised it was number 10 Downing Street ringing. So they said, a car is outside your house and it's going to take you to Downing Street. So it was already there, glided outside my house. Off I went, and the cars were then all lining up outside Downing Street to go in one by one. And I saw Chris Smith getting out of his car. And my driver said, look, there's Chris Smith. He thinks he's going to the health department, but he's not. And I was like, oh, because he'd been Shadow Health Secretary. No, he's going to the Department of Culture. So basically, all the drivers, all the infrastructure, all the private offices, the system knows. The people who don't know are the people who are going to be given those great offices. Then they go off to their department and they discover they already have a diary full of engagements, meetings to have, staff already in place, and off they go.
We need to say congratulations to you, because we heard last night that you are to get a peerage. So congratulations on that. Does that come with a job, perhaps? Do you think number 10 might be calling you again this afternoon?
I'm sure they won't be, but I think it's like, what a moment to be retiring from the House of Commons when Labour has a huge majority, albeit there is work to do on rebuilding public trust, and I'm sure we'll discuss that, but also 264 women MPs. And when I was first an MP, it was 20. what a huge amount of social change and progress that marks. So I'm feeling well cheerful.
Would you like a job?
I don't know. I don't know. I'll have to see. I really
saying
don't
no.
know.
You're not saying
I don't
no.
know. I've just sort of. I'm just really delighted at the moment that we've got a huge majority, a mandate, and I'm also delighted with Keir's speech, which was so well placed, because it talks about the wound that's got to be healed of the lack of public trust. He's not saying, look everybody, I've got a whacking majority and I'm going to ram everything through the House of Commons. He's like, be in partnership with me in government. National renewal requires all of this to do this. I know that there's a lack of trust because look at the fall in turnout. I know we have to rebuild that trust. And I thought it was a very, it was a humble speech, not a shred of triumphalism. So
I can't source this to any government drivers, but there's a rumour going around here that you might get the Equality and Human Rights Commission job.
Well, that was in the newspapers, and it is true, sometimes you do find out what you're going to do by the newspapers. I only found out that I was going to chair the Privileges Committee by reading it in the Telegraph. So it is quite odd sometimes how these things happen. But the main thing is I'm very excited to see them going down Downing Street and just wishing them all the best, because being in government is hard, and it's going to be especially hard for them. But I'm so full of confidence of this team, and I'll tell you why in due course.
Ian Hislop, you have been watching this for a very long time, the comings
You're
and
not
goings.
going to congratulate me on my peerage?
Have you got one? I mean, that
the
will be breaking
phone's
news.
just waiting.
I wasn't alerted to that fact, but if you have, No, you have been watching these comings and goings for a very long time. What have you made the last 24 hours?
Well, it was an absolutely extraordinary result, and all the commentators are right. I mean, they were looking for an adjective. Is it a landslide? Is it Starmageddon? And I think it's about punishment. And I've never seen the public in such vindictive mood. I mean, any hint of corruption, any hint, Scotland out. We've had enough of you. Rishi, all of you out. And that is sort of terribly pleasing as an expression of popular distaste for a government which has become a byword for corruption. And the campaign was, at every point, the metaphors were exactly that. It was betting. It was literally, you cannot even go in a room together without one of you trying to make money. So when Keir Starmer appears and starts talking about public service, it's a slight shock. It's like it's in a minor key. We are so used to boosterism. This is going to be fantastic. I'm going to be absolutely marvellous. Everything will be marvellous. A man comes on saying, well, it's going to be terrible. And for me, it was a triumph of the boring. And that's good.
But does that make your job quite difficult going forward?
No. The thing about sort of caricatures is they've done most of the work for you. And that takes the fun out of it in a lot of ways. So I think we've done personality. And what I kept noticing is just everybody saying on their speeches, well, at least we've got somebody who plays by the rules. And you thought, this is all Partygate again, isn't it? We have heard this. This is a real, I think, public fed-upness with what they perceive as all the things that Rishi Sunak said would be lack of corruption, transparency, integrity, and then that didn't happen. And in the middle of the campaign, there's a pile of PPE equipment, which is worth as much in waste as the entire Labour plans for increasing the health service. I mean, metaphors are everywhere, and people spot them. And in the end, they said no.
We've talked a lot about the speech he made. Let's actually hear what Keir Starmer said. It was, just over an hour ago, outside the door of number 10.
You have given us a clear mandate, and we will use it to deliver change, to restore service and respect to politics, end the era of noisy performance, tread more lightly on your lives, and unite our country. 4 nations standing together again, facing down, as we have so often in our past, the challenges of an insecure world, committed to a calm and patient rebuilding.
Harriet Harman, I mean, they've got 412 seats, Labour. The vote was 9,686,000. Sir Keir Starmer, in that speech, addressed directly the people who had not voted for him. It's very striking that in this election, Sir Keir Starmer has actually won fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn. He got 10.27 million. In 1997, Tony Blair, 13.5 million. It is extraordinary. He has got this success on the back of actually fewer votes.
Well, this is a first-past-the-post system, and one of the things that the Labour Party under Keir Starmer did is set out to win the seats that we needed to win. So they didn't campaign in safe Labour areas. They campaigned in areas where they had a chance of winning and thereby built up this massive majority. But they're not then taking that for granted and saying, right, obviously everybody thinks we're marvellous. They're recognising that we have got a very big majority, but there is a big lack of public confidence just in turnout for a start. There was quite a low turnout. So I think he thinks that the task of national renewal is a very great task. And actually, even were there not a low turnout, and even had we not got our majority on a smaller percentage of the vote, I think that he still would think that we have to be in partnership with people to deliver this. Government can't do it by itself. I mean, some people have said, oh, that means we should change the voting system because he's got a great big landslide majority on quite a small percentage of the vote. I think rather than trying to fiddle around with the voting system, and we had a referendum in 2011 to change the voting system, and the answer was no. So instead of fiddling with the voting system, we need to crack on with what people's priorities are.
It is unsurprising that Labour aren't going to be very keen on changing the voting system after getting that level of majority. I mean, I can see the enthusiasm's going to wane. There may be other parties, though, who suddenly discover it. Some of the smaller parties might say, well, I'm thinking of reform.
Yeah. I mean, reform figures 14% of the vote,
yes.
4 seats.
And I'm amazed that he hasn't contacted you already and suggested that he's on this panel, because it's unrepresentative without him on it. I mean, one of you should stand aside.
And the Liberal Democrats got fewer votes than Reform, so they got almost 3.5 million, 71 seats.
71 seats, yeah. It's a system that people are now going to decide is quite good.
The perfect moment to look at some more numbers, I think, and just to recap on some of the data, some of the stats that have come in. Christian can go through it with us. Hi, Christian, what you got?
Hello, John. Yes, well, here is the punishment that the voters dealt out to the Conservatives, down 250 seats. They've lost 2/3. It is without precedent in history. I'm just going to add some caution on our forecast. There are 2 seats to declare. One is South Basildon, the other is Inverness. We're hearing from Scotland that actually that forecast might be out because the SNP have big worries about Inverness, so maybe we can put one more in that column, which would be extraordinary. 6 seats for the Liberal Democrats in Scotland. Let's have a look at who paid the biggest price on the night. Here are the big beasts. Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, losing in Welwyn Hatfield. That was a 10,000 majority, wiped out by the swing to Labour. Penny Mordaunt, a steady hand through the coronation, but stumbling in Portsmouth North. That is a 16,000 majority that's gone. Liz Truss, you were just talking about vote share there. 24,000 majority, and Labour has won it with less than 27% of the vote share. That's because it was split 4 ways. Here's a few others for you to think about. This one is Gillian Keegan. That's almost a straight swing, 30-odd% to the Liberal Democrats in Chichester. Alex Chalk was always actually in trouble in Cheltenham. He only had a slender majority there. The Justice Secretary and the Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, another victim in the Forest of Dean. Now, I want to talk about Scotland because actually I've talked a lot about vote share through the course of the day, and yes, it only went up 2 or 3 points, and it's less than Jeremy Corbyn in 2017. But actually, in Scotland, I think Labour had an absolutely fantastic night. Obviously, the rebuild had to come through Glasgow. It had to come through, North Lanarkshire, through South Lanarkshire and Rutherglen out to Renfrewshire. And if I click it forward, you'll see that they won all 6 Glasgow seats. I think they'll take particular pride in winning back Gordon Brown's seat, Cowdenbeath and Kirkcaldy. You've got Alistair Lothian East, Douglas Alexander, it just sprung to mind. Douglas Alexander there in Lothian East. And also 2 good seats here for the Lib Dems. That's Nicky Campbell's old seat. And this one, do you remember this? Joe Swinson, beaten in 2019, that little jig for joy that the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, did that night when they got rid of Joe Swinson. Well, there is the Lib Dem revenge. What about Wales? Well, this is a different story, actually, to Scotland. Conservatives were defending 12. Let me fast forward it. They got rid of the Welsh Secretary Labour in Monmouthshire. They got rid of, in fact, Plaid Cymru got rid of the Chief Whip, Simon Hart, up there. That was a good one, actually, for Plaid, Ynys-Môn. That's the oldest, that's the constituency with the oldest boundaries, going all the way back to 1535 to Henry VIII. And that is a genuine 3-way marginal that Plaid Cymru won. They won 4 seats overnight in Wales. Good result for them. But actually, when you look at Wales, the vote share is down 4 on a pretty poor performance in 2019. Remember, Vaughan Gething lost a vote of no confidence in Wales, and also their record is under scrutiny in Wales. So not that clever for Wales, in Wales, for Labour. Good night, of course, for the Greens. Both Adrian Ramsey and Carla Denyer, the co-leaders of Greens, are in. He's in Waveney Valley. She is in Bristol Central. Labour threw everything at this. Thangam Debonair, the shadow culture secretary, she would have been culture secretary had she hung on. They sent Dale Vince down there to campaign for Green voters. They sent Ed Miliband down there. They couldn't see off the vote for the Greens. And also, just a final one, I want to talk about the independents because there were some absolute shocking results for Labour up and down the country as well as they did, but perhaps no worse than this one. Jonathan Ashworth, Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, major figure in the Labour Party, would certainly have been in the cabinet, losing to Shochat Adam. One of 4 seats, 5 if you include Jeremy Corbyn, that went to people who were campaigning on Palestinian issues, on Gaza and the Middle East. A real shocker there for Jonathan Ashworth, and you can see that's almost a direct swing from Labour to the Independents.
Christian Fraser, thank you very much. Let's go to Northern Ireland now as well, because a night of history there. Sinn Féin has won the most seats for the first time. Nuala McGovern is there for us. Nuala.
Welcome to the Titanic Quarter. Over my shoulder is actually where the Titanic was built. You might remember Rishi Sunak visited here not so long ago and was asked, was he the captain of a sinking ship? Well, that ship has sailed. Let us talk about what has happened overnight, also called seismic shifts, political earthquakes. 7 seats for Sinn Féin. That's the Nationalist Party, and with that they have created a hat-trick, not just winning the most seats for Northern Ireland Party in Westminster, but also with Council and with the Northern Ireland Assembly as well. What was the big upset? The DUP. The questions were whether they could retain their seats. They did not. They have lost 3. They're down to 5 at this point. The unionist vote is now fractured. There was the TUV, the traditional unionist voice. There was also the UUP, the Ulster Unionist Party, 2 votes and 1 independent unionist. And so the questions are about the future of unionism in Northern Ireland. But also there was alliance. They also created quite the upset. And with me is Kate Nichols. She is MLA, so a member of the Legislative Assembly in Northern Ireland for South Belfast, as the constituency will be known. Was running to be an MP last night. That didn't happen, Kate, so commiserations.
Thank you.
But let us move on to that, what people are calling a shocker that happened in Lagan Valley. Now, this was Sir Geoffrey Donaldson's former DUP leader. It was his seat. He has been charged with historical sex offences, including rape, which he is contesting. But for the first time, somebody from the Alliance Party, a woman, and the first time in 40 years, a non-unionist, has unseated a unionist in that constituency.
I mean, it's seismic, and anyone who knows Saoirse Eastwood knew that this was on the card. Saoirse has been campaigning for this seat for as long as I've known her, and it is historic. She is a non-unionist, she's a woman, she's the 3rd MP ever in Lagan Valley, and she's going to bring a really fresh approach to politics and just signifies the change that's happening in Northern Ireland.
But some people have called it the Donaldson effect. Do you think that's fair, that it was because of Sir Geoffrey Donaldson that in fact she managed to have this win?
No, the reason why she got the win is because she represents the new Northern Ireland. She is a cross-community, progressive, positive candidate who really wants the best for Lagan Valley. Yes, the DUP had a part in this because they haven't delivered. I think the collapse of the Assembly, I think what's happening with Jeffrey Donaldson all contributed, but it can't take away from Saoirse's monumental success, and we're so proud of her.
What do you think is going to be her first priority?
Reform. Reform of the institutions is something that Saoirse talks about all the time. It's something Alliance has really been pushing. The fact that the Assembly stops and starts, it's no more stable today than it was the last time it collapsed. So we really need reform of the institutions. And the UK government and the Irish government have acknowledged that this is important. And everyone has said, with hindsight, previous Secretary of States, that this is something that needs to happen so that no party can collapse it. Saoirse's really going to be pushing this, and financial stability for Northern Ireland.
It's so interesting you say that, because another really big upset happened in North Antrim, ending the House of Paisley, as it has been called. For the first time in over 50 years, 54 to be exact, there is not a Paisley representing in North Antrim, considered one of the safest seats for the DUP. That has been taken by Jim Allister from the TUV, the traditional unionist voice, who disagreed with the Assembly reconvening in February. So how do you understand that narrative? What is going to happen in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, and this was the safest seat for the DUP. No one imagined this happening. We thought maybe the majority would narrow, but this is extraordinary. Jim Allister is a very interesting politician. He did disagree with the protocol. In my experience, he disagrees with most things, so he's going to be an interesting addition to the Green benches. But things are changing, and I think the DUP really have to look at how they've operated the last number of years. Bringing down the Assembly over something that could only be dealt with by Westminster and the EU was reckless, and it was holding the people of Northern
we
Ireland
have
hostage.
to butt in there. I'm really sorry. Let's go live to Downing Street again, because as you can see, walking up to the front door of number 10 Downing Street, Angela Rayner. In opposition, she was Deputy Leader of Labour. She was Shadow Deputy Prime Minister, Shadow Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Shadow Housing and Communities. What will her job be? She's the first potential member of the Shadow Cabinet to turn up and meet Sir Keir Starmer inside, and Laura Koonsberg is there. Laura.
Well, John, the fact that Angela Rayner is arriving first suggests that she will indeed, in a matter of moments, become the Deputy Prime Minister. As you say, she's been Deputy Leader of the Labour Party for some time, which makes her unique in Keir Starmer's team, because it means she has been elected Deputy Leader by Labour Party members, so she has her own mandate. Now, things have not always been plain sailing between her and Sir Keir Starmer. They had a bust-up a few years ago. She was tried to be reshuffled and pushed aside. She didn't want any of it, dug her heels in, and actually ended up with a job title just about as long as your arm. So Angela Rayner is a powerful figure in the Labour Party in her own right, but she's just gone in, the first person we expect to be appointed as part of Sir Keir Starmer's cabinet. I would absolutely expect the fact she's arrived first that she will be made Deputy Prime Minister. That's not official, but that's what we would definitely expect here in number 10 this afternoon. It's likely that she would be Deputy Prime Minister with responsibility for housing. We know that's a matter close to her heart. So is the issue of workers' rights. Labour has a big plan to increase the rights of people at work. Controversial with some people in the business world, but the party has worked very, very hard to develop those plans. She's had a very public association with those plans, so perhaps that might be the kind of role that is given to her too. But we'll have to wait for the details of what she's given. But a very quietly delighted, I would say, Angela Rayner walking into Downing Street this afternoon.
Laura, we'll be back to you shortly. Yeah, she was rather poker-faced there. It was hard to work out what she was thinking. But Harriet Harman, what a moment potentially for Angela Rayner.
Absolutely, and I would say she's got a serious and determined face. You know, she is a formidable woman, and I'm so proud to see her walking down Downing Street to be Deputy Prime Minister. And I feel very confident in her because she is incredibly robust and strong, and she knows why she's doing her politics. It is not a job for her. It's not a career. It's her whole being. You know, she had a very difficult upbringing. She had a baby when she was a teenager, and she knows what it's like to struggle, and she's determined to be in government so other people can have better opportunities. And as Laura just said, Keir Starmer at one point did try to sideline her, And she wouldn't be sidelined. She didn't say, oh, right, we mustn't have any rows within the party, we've all got to keep on an even keel. She said, no, I'm entitled to be there and I'm going to stay there. And she faced him down. And I think after that, they've got a better relationship, which is one of mutual respect. So I really admire her, and I think she'll be doing workers' rights. She's very close to the union. She was a union official herself, but she's not afraid to disagree with the unions if she thinks they're wrong.
And it is a moment of history as well. She will become Labour's first deputy female prime minister, won't she?
Absolutely, long overdue.
They'll have a female prime minister one day, the Labour Party.
The female Chancellor of the Exchequer we expect as well.
Yes, so they're making up for it. I mean, there was a bit of a row between Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner over Diane Abbott quite recently, so it wasn't all years ago.
Are you watching closely how these relationships are put under extra strain in government? It's one thing holding together an opposition with one date in mind, isn't it, the election?
Yeah.
Now it's a bit different.
And also, I mean, there is the example of the cabinet that literally couldn't even meet Sunak's cabinet without A, disagreeing, and B, them all briefing immediately. So everybody is going to be waiting to try and find disagreements between, and let's be honest, the people who they've heard of, which is sort of three of them really. It's Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner and Rachel Reeves. There's not a huge number of people on the front bench that people outside this tent know about. So that relationship, it will be the focus of the press. They will be looking for it, saying, how quickly are you going to have a row? So my guess is, and Keir is basically still holding the vase. You know, he's got it there, but it's still there. And I think that caution is going to continue.
I think Laura's still in Downing Street and can hear us. Laura, would Angela Rayner know what job she's going to get? I mean, surely she's been told to prepare.
Well, I think there's been such superstition, I've got to say, and everybody around Keir Starmer in the last couple of weeks, you know, journalists like me have been asking the question, well, hypothetically, if it does work out the way that you want, and the first response is, well, no, I'm not taking anything for granted, I don't want to talk about it. So you try the question again, well, hypothetically, if the polls are even vaguely right, do you expect that you will have a job in the administration? Well, I'm not sure, all talk of any jobs is banned. So there's been a lot of superstition around. That said, let's not kid ourselves here. There has been a very extensive weeks and months of preparation. The civil service have been involved. There's been talks between the shadow teams, as they have been, who are becoming government teams today, and senior officials over quite a period of time. So there is no question that Keir Starmer has known what he wants to do with his top team. And I would say the majority of them do know or anticipate what job they're going to get. Angela Rayner is certainly one of them, and the fact that she went in first means that I think we can assume, although first rule of journalism, especially in this country and politics, never assume. So why am I even saying that? But it would be very, very strange if Angela Rayner was not going to emerge Deputy Prime Minister. I think it's very likely that she will have a role to try to deal with what a lot of people see as the housing crisis in this country. However, until we see it coming out officially, or perhaps a little word from her on the way out of the door when we see her emerge, I think we just have to hold our horses. But remember, one of the interesting things about her is that in the last couple of months we saw a sustained period of time when the Conservatives were going for her over those allegations that some years ago she hadn't paid the correct amount of capital gains tax when she sold a property. She lived somewhere else separate from her husband at the time, and the press went after her, particularly the papers on the right, and the Conservative Party headquarters was trying very, very hard to go for Angela Rayner. Now, the interesting thing was she just didn't, at the beginning of all of it, kind of come completely clean about exactly what had happened. She said she'd done nothing wrong, they would clear it up in time, but there were some people in the party who were frustrated with her that she wasn't just immediately transparent, because it was quite a saga in politics that was a real distraction for Keir Starmer at the beginning. But the reason, actually, that I think is instructive about this is the Conservatives were eager to go after her because she's one of the few politicians, and was one of the few politicians in opposition, who did have what we elusively call cut through with the public. So if you talk to pollsters and focus group people who work with voters and do little groups and samples of voters all the time, they would tell you that Angela Rayner was one of the few opposition politicians who the public had noticed. She'd made people sit up, and they knew that she had a big profile, and lo and behold, that made the Conservatives go after her. However, they weren't successful. It was shown that she didn't do anything wrong. Here she is this afternoon, about to get a huge, massively significant job, as Harriet Harman was reminding us, coming from a pretty tough background that she talks about a lot when she talks about her own politics. And now we expect about to be the second most senior politician in the country.
Quite a moment. And do you agree with that? She has that cut through.
She absolutely does. I think, she is what is a rather overused word, authentic. I think that people know that she's in it for other people, and she could not be further away from the people who are in it for a career or who are in it to do some betting or to make money on the side. She's the polar opposite of that, and therefore very good to stand alongside Keir Starmer to show that, goodness me, this government has changed. The government has changed.
The feeling seems to be from Labour that they want to hit the ground immediately, that they might work through large amounts of the summer, cancel recess for the usual recess, that they are determined to make an impact policy-wise immediately. Is that what you're hearing?
That's right, and I think that's for two reasons. Firstly, because they know they get into government, but with a big lack of confidence in all parties and in the whole of government and our politics. So they want to start rebuilding that straight away. And secondly, because the future public service investment depends on growth, they want to start with the work that's going to unleash growth, particularly on changing planning so we can have housing and infrastructure getting going, and also GB energy. So actually there's work to do, but there's also a performative aspect of it. Look, we know we've got a job to do, and we're not going to wallow around just enjoying the fact that we've got all these titles and these offices now. We're going to get on with work for you. But there's also a very strong invitation to the public to be part of it. So I think all sectors are going to find that there's a massive reach out. It's not ministers sitting in small rooms deciding what's going to be done. They're going to say, right, how are we going to do it to make it work?
We are hoping we will see Rachel Reeves, I'm sure, walk down Downing Street before too long. We have with us here in the studio a former Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, Chancellor for just 38 days.
38 days, exactly.
Your reaction to what has been a disastrous night for the Conservatives?
Look, it was a difficult night.
Difficult?
I think, well, of course, I mean, one shouldn't sugarcoat
More than difficult.
that. Okay, it was a disaster, it was a catastrophe, it was a really bad result. And the polls had presaged that, for weeks, if not months. And I think the natural tendency of the Tory party will be to panic, which I don't think it should do. I think Rishi Sunak did the right thing, saying that he was going to step down, but he was going to stay for as long as the process was in place to get a new leader. And we're just going to have to wait and see what the government's agenda will be, because the manifesto in itself, the Labour manifesto, didn't reveal that much about what their strategy would be. And we've just got to wait and see how they take about the business of government.
You mentioned the polls being right. Can we just look at the polls over the last couple of years? Because it was just after your mini-budget that was the point of no return for the Conservatives. To what extent do you think that was partly your fault?
That was an issue, but at the time, and it was we confidently thought, as it happened in most parliaments, sorry I didn't...
Let's just come back to that,
Secretary
because
of State,
there's
Pat
McFadden arriving at number 10, Laura.
That's right. Now, Pat McFadden is not a household name, although he is somebody who was put forward and seen on the airwaves a lot during the campaign. And he certainly, I think, is going to be a household name before too long. Pat McFadden was essentially the campaign chief on behalf of Keir Starmer. He's a long-serving MP with a constituency in the West Midlands. He's somebody who used to work once upon a time for Tony Blair. Somebody who not necessarily a while ago was a natural political bedfellow of Keir Starmer, but certainly over the last period he has been absolutely at the nerve centre of plotting and planning Labour's return to government. So fascinating that he has gone in second after Angela Rayner. We might have expected him to get some kind of senior job, not quite sure what title it might be, perhaps the really fancy one, Chancellor of the the Duchy of Lancaster, essentially somebody who's responsible for the mechanics of government. In other words, the person who's in charge of getting things done, which for Keir Starmer is going to be a really, really important role. But perhaps also reflecting not just his experience in government, but also this victory which Pat McFadden has been absolutely part of putting together. Keir Starmer asking him in as number 2 to be invited into cabinet this afternoon is a really significant moment. And John and Sophie, if people watching at home haven't really heard of him so far, I think in the next couple of years they're going to hear a lot about his importance.
And going in ahead of Rachel Reeves is interesting. Should we read anything into that, Laura?
Well, I think that it depends really what the titles are going to be. So in Westminster, guess what? Sometimes there's a little bit of one-upmanship. Sometimes there's a little bit of Whitehall ranking and interest in exactly which particular bits of the chairs of government and the chairs around the cabinet table are doled out in which particular order. So I wonder if Pat McFadden goes in, does suggest that he is going to get some kind of primary role, perhaps first Secretary of State. But there's Nigel Farage taking his place at the lectern. We're going to go to the Reform press conference after their success overnight.
Where are you from? Oh, well, that makes sense. Yeah. Are you downwind of a couple already? You've had a bigger lunch than I've had. God, he must be screaming. He's absolutely steaming, isn't he? That's all right. There's still plenty of beer left in the pub, mate. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye. Lots of love. Lots of love.
Well, heckling going on at the Nigel Farage press conference. Reform, of course, winning 4 seats overnight, but the press conference there, Nigel Farage was about to begin, disrupted by a heckler who's been removed. Let's listen in.
I decided that I would not. I decided that I would not. Boring. 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 Boring.
Well, more heckling there. Another protester being taken out of the Reform press conference. Nigel Farage saying boring, 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 and joking with the audience that it will be a taste of what awaits him in the House of Commons. He, of course, victorious at his 8th time of asking, becoming an MP for Clacton in Essex with an overwhelming victory. I'm enjoying this, Mr. Farage says. Who'd have thunk it, enjoying having made
lots of love.
A big impact on the Conservatives, waving goodbye to the hecklers. Just in front of him, Richard Tice, another senior figure in Reform. And there is another protester. Nigel Farage says, any more for any more? And yes, there is. This is almost turning into a sort of performance event, isn't it? Nigel Farage often both attracts and courts controversy wherever he goes. But his victory press conference, having achieved 4 seats in Westminster, turning into something that appears really to be rather chaotic.
So, Laura, he's got 4 seats. They have won 4 seats, Reform UK, but this is probably not the start that Nigel Farage would want for his new party.
No, I mean, it looks pretty shambolic and chaotic. I wonder, however, Sophie, if really we should be surprised. We can see people being manhandled and escorted out of the event there. Nigel Farage suggesting they may be planted activists. It looks like there's more of this going on at the back. And indeed there is. There's somebody else making a very strong protest. And this, I suppose, despite the success of Reform, in terms of the numbers of votes they've achieved at this general election, that they are delighted with. However, this is a reminder on day 1 of just how controversially many of the public view them.
And just when he thinks that he's about to start, Nigel Farage was about to start speaking again. And so I make that 6, 7 protesters who are all being hauled out one by one. But as you say, it really does give a sign of possibly what he can expect in Parliament in the weeks and months and years to come.
Well, so far there have been more protesters removed than seats they won in Westminster. But as you say, you can see, journalists sitting, waiting patiently, unusually perhaps, for the press events to begin. Let's listen to what he's saying.
Clear objectives.
I think
The
we can
first was for us to get millions of votes. The second was to establish a bridgehead in Parliament. And you can see there are four of us up here now as we bite our nails with what is going on in Basildon and Thurrock right now, where our candidate, James McMurdoch, on the first count was ahead by 120 votes. On the second count was ahead again, and there is a full recount taking place as I speak. So I'm very hopeful it won't be 4. I'm very hopeful that it will be 5 within the space of the next couple of hours. Now, the results show us some very interesting things. If we had proportional representation, we'd be looking at nearly 100 seats. But equally, first past the post inverts the other way, where Labour get almost the same number of votes they got, well, in fact, fewer votes they got under Corbyn, and yet 200 more seats. It is very much my view that our outdated first past the post electoral system is not fit for purpose, and we will campaign with anyone and everyone to change this electoral system. That certainly we'll be doing, and we'll make those arguments in Parliament as quickly as we can. The results show there is absolutely no enthusiasm for Starmer's Labour whatsoever. And it was interesting to watch Starmer speak outside number 10, his first prime ministerial address, having been to see the King. And in the course of that speech, he looked down at his notes over 150 times. Once every 2.8 seconds. Now, I don't think these people with me need a script because they know what they believe in. And when it comes to providing the voice of opposition, well, we may be too few in number to necessarily be thought of as the opposition in the House of Commons. But let me promise you something. We are going to be the opposition around the country. We are all committed to working for our constituents. We are all committed to doing the best we can in Parliament. But above all, what we are going to do from today is we are going to professionalise the party. We are going to democratise the party, and those few bad apples that have crept in will be gone, will be long gone, and we will never have any of their type back in our organisation. You have the 100% promise on that.
We will leave Nigel Farage's press conference right there because we can go back to Downing Street.
What is remarkable?
I think we have another arrival. And we can see there, is that... That's Bridget Phillipson, I think, going in.
Let's join Laura. She's in Downing Street. Laura.
I think that was a glimpse of Shabana Mahmood, but there, right at the gates, is Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, striding into number 10. And our full expectation is that in a matter of moments she will be appointed the United Kingdom's first ever female Chancellor. An economist by trade, she worked as a young economist at the Bank of England. She's been an MP for some time. She was not part of Jeremy Corbyn's shadow team. She sat that out on the back benches, but gained experience as the chair of the Business Committee during that period. But Rachel Reeves, who together with Keir Starmer has made such an effort to rebuild the party's relationship with the business community, and of course her views, her tight grip, as she always said, on what Labour's public finances would look like has been such a feature of their campaign, and a big smile there from Rachel Reeves. She has waited a long time for this. She may only be 45, but this has been a job of work for many, many years. And of course, it is her decisions in conjunction with Keir Starmer that set Labour on this path to what they would boast about as being the reality of being in a position to win, having to get British voters to once again trust the Labour Party with their money. But for some in the party, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer's view of the world is a risk. It may not do enough to get public services back up and running in the way that many voters would want them to, because her grip on the purse strings, which she would make absolutely clear, has done for such a long time, is too tight for the like of some people on the left of the Labour Party. But in she walks to number 10. Number 11 will be hers, and Rachel Reeves is very, very likely in the next couple of minutes to be appointed the first female Chancellor. There at the gates then, we can just show you up there, a slightly less familiar figure, Shabana Mahmood. She's an MP and part of Birmingham, and she has been the Shadow Justice Secretary. And she is a former senior lawyer herself. And this is turning into a bit of a queue now, isn't it? She's waiting there for her instructions, so they make sure they get the choreography absolutely right. Here she comes, Shabana Mahmood, Birmingham MP, Shadow Justice Secretary, who will, we'd highly expect, be taking charge of the nation's courts and prisons. And she may well have one of the most urgent problems to deal with. There was a little bit of discussion, in fact we asked her about it towards the end of the campaign, about the situation in the country's prisons, overflowing at capacity, people having to be let out early. I understand there have in the last few weeks been some crisis meetings in Whitehall about exactly what's going on with prison overcrowding. Shabana Mahmood striding up purposely there may very, very soon face very tricky decisions indeed about what to do of that. Like other Labour MPs, had faced a challenge from independents in her community who were campaigning for Palestinian rights, who were unhappy about the position that the Labour Party had taken. But in she goes, no hanging around. Anyone would think, John and Sophie, that they're keen to crack on.
They certainly are, aren't they? It's a quick, swift line coming down Downing Street.
Not hanging around at all, yeah.
Harriet Harman, you were
There's
talking
someone else queuing
earlier.
up, I think. In fact, I think I can see two of them queuing up at the top.
Who have you got?
I think there, if I don't actually have a telescope, but I think that is John Healey wearing a red tie.
Yeah.
Purposely striding up the street, and we would expect John Healey to become Labour's first Defence Secretary since 2010. Now, John Healey is interesting. He's looked after the defence brief for quite some time, but he's one of the few people in Keir Starmer's team who has actually, once upon a time, had a job in government. Because it's such a long time since Labour has actually been in power, there are very few people in the top team who have got previous experience in government. But John Healey was one of Gordon Brown's minister, little smile there, but striking a serious tone. And just think what's on his plate. Mr. Healey, are you confident you're going to be Defence Secretary? And in he goes. I think we can be confident he's going to be the Defence Secretary. Keir Starmer, one of his first tasks, will be flying off to the NATO summit in Washington, actually in just a matter of days. I mean, imagine the weight of that as a brand new leader who's campaigned mainly on domestic issues, but is absolutely now in charge of one of the biggest countries in the world, the sixth biggest economy in the world, a country that's got many important defence alliances, work in Ukraine, and in terms of the conflict in the Middle East, so much going on for that. But let me introduce you to the next member of Keir Starmer's cabinet, Wes Streeting. Now, he's been a very, very well-known member of Keir Starmer's team. Once upon a time, he was a very young president of the National Union of Students. He's been a political campaigner all his life. He only just held on to his seat, interestingly enough. But as he strides up the street, we expect that he will be put in charge at the Department of Health. Somebody who doesn't mince his words, somebody who himself draws on his own experience as a cancer survivor. Big smile there, Wes Streeting. Are you going to be the Health Secretary? Oh, there was a nod. There we are. I don't quite know if he actually confirmed it, but I think that Wes Streeting does very much believe that he's about to be made the Health Secretary. And he is one of those politicians who spent a lot of time in the last couple of months behind the scenes preparing for what is about to happen. And preparing, he hopes, to be able to show the millions of voters who have put the cross of the box for the Labour Party that Labour actually will be able to turn around the state of waiting lists, to try to increase provision for things that sound as simple as NHS dentists, but so many people watching this afternoon will have had experiences we've heard so much about in the last few years, really frustrating experiences where people just have not been able to get access to the kind of care that they would expect. So huge challenges for him, huge challenges, frankly, John and Sophie, for all of them. But what they don't so far seem to be having a challenge with is getting them in, drawing up the list and getting on with it.
I think you've got
Risk,
David Lammy. I think David Lammy is coming your way. Is it usually as fast as this, Laura?
No, it's not. I mean, I have for my sins stood here and watched quite a lot of reshuffles, and normally, even when it's a new government, it takes a little bit longer than this, but David Lammy is next to walk up. He's been the Shadow Foreign Secretary, and there he is. And they're all, fascinatingly, that woman there with the long blonde hair is timing them all to make sure they get the choreography of this exactly right, so there isn't a sort of traffic jam for the cameras. So they will all get their Kodak moment as they walk up Downing Street. But David Lammy, expected very much to be Foreign Secretary in Whitehall. There's been a bit of speculation in some of the papers that maybe he wouldn't get that job, but in Whitehall the expectation, and in the Foreign Office I understand that has been the expectation, pretty much nailed on for the last little while. Smile from him there. Let's see if he'll give us a nod. Are you going to be Foreign Secretary, Mr. Lammy? Oh, he looks resolutely ahead as he goes in for his moment with Keir Starmer. And he attracted some criticism from their political opponents during the campaign because once upon a time, like a lot of prominent Labour politicians, he was somebody who questioned the renewal of Trident, the nuclear deterrent. He was somebody who's also been very outspoken about former President Trump. He has used some pretty tough language about the kind of man and the kind of politician that President Trump is. Now imagine if President Trump does make it back to the White House. Imagine if we, as expect, David Lammy as the Foreign Secretary. How is that partnership between the UK and the United States going to work when you have lots of prominent Labour politicians who have had some very, very sharp criticisms of President Trump? But it certainly looks like David Lammy is on his way to be Foreign Secretary, and there's another one.
Yeah, Peter Kyle, we were talking to him just a short time ago, right here in the studio. There he is, waiting for his moment, as you say, being lined up so that you don't want them too fast, do you? But he's being lined up there so that he can take his place in front of the cameras at the appropriate time.
It really will be just a moment, won't it?
That's right.
Because he's only going to be in there for a second before the next one will be there, Laura.
Well, that's right. I mean, I do get the impression that they have timed this, you know, almost to the 30 seconds. We saw how they placed all those activists and campaigners and friends and families of Keir Starmer here to welcome him. But I get the impression from this that they have literally timed it to the minute. Peter Kyle's just sending, looks like he's sending a text there to someone. Maybe he's sending a text, I don't know, maybe he's sending a text to someone in his family saying, put the telly on, it's my turn. We expect him to take charge of what's called DSIT, one of those terrible Whitehall acronyms, but the Department of Science and Technology. So Peter Kyle definitely would be seen as being on the right of the Labour Party, very close ally and friend of Wes Streeting, both of them tucked over in that side of the party, somebody who worked formerly as an advisor in Whitehall back in the new Labour days. Are you going to be Science Secretary, Peter Kyle? I'm the first one to give a little wave, delighting the snappers who try to get all of them to give a wave so they get the picture that they want for tomorrow's papers.
And Laura, I can tell you the next in line. Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson is there. She was here very early this morning with us with her phone, clutching her phone, but I assume she's expecting to be made Education Secretary.
I think no doubt about it, Sophie. This is working quite well, isn't it? You can see them before I can, and then in they come. There she strides as well. Bridget Phillipson, another one of those politicians who maybe if you're watching this afternoon a couple of months ago, you might not have known very much about. You might not even ever have heard of her, but she's been very prominent in the campaign, talking about Labour's plans for breakfast clubs in schools, talking about Labour's plans for more mental health provision for children in school, and very much taking a forward role in the kind of arguments for the bread and butter improvements that Labour is promising to people around the country. She's an MP for Sunderland up in the northeast who held her seat very comfortably last night, no surprise there. But just as all of these politicians, they have a big job ahead of them. Are you the new Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson? And a smile, they're almost all racing in, aren't they? I mean, anyone would think that they've been waiting a long time. But what a huge job that they all have. You know, smiles today, but very, very tough inboxes and in trays that are waiting for them.
Yeah, and Laura, Bridget Phillipson is close to Keir Starmer, isn't she?
Certainly. I mean, at the beginning of the campaign, somebody in the Labour tent was telling me about what they saw for the public to see, but also the way that they regarded things internally. They talked about the sort of the Fab Four, the people who people might see. So whether it's Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, of course, health so important to all our viewers watching this afternoon. Education, of course, the quality of education, how children learn in this country, the kind of support that is available for families, so important to people watching around the country. Rachel Reeves, so many photo opportunities of her and Keir Starmer alongside each other. So these new generation politicians, not been in government before, but people who no doubt have made no secret of being deadly serious about getting back into power, deadly serious about winning, and deadly serious about their preparation for government in the last couple of months. Interesting to note, though, and this rankles people on the Labour left, all of those politicians I've just mentioned would be seen as being more on the right wing of the Labour Party than more comfortable in left-wing circles. What Keir Starmer would say, though, is that they're all one big happy team working together, which certainly today they will be. But given the challenges ahead of them, of course, people will be looking for cracks.
Another one approaching you now, Laura. Annalise Dodds on her way to you.
Annalise Dodds, who's been the chair of the Labour Party when Keir Starmer was first elected as leader of the opposition. She was his Shadow Chancellor. She is one of the Oxford Labour MPs, and she was his Shadow Chancellor for a while. But in his big first reshuffle,
corner, Laura,
which
apparently. If you're watching
tricky
at home and you've just seen my predecessor on BBC Breakfast, Dan Walker, walking up there, I think he's walking to the Channel 5 News position, not into the new cabinet.
So Dan Walker's not going to be a government minister. Okay, I don't know if that's good news or bad news for our viewers, John. You tell me. But yeah, Annalise Dodds then I think is just around the corner. As you were saying, Sophie, they're all being held until just the right moment to make sure that they all get their individual photographs and
Laura, this must be a particularly difficult day for Jonathan Ashworth and Thangam Debonair, given they are watching all their colleagues, people who they've been in the shadow cabinet with, walking down Downing Street, and they could have been there, but they are not. They've both lost their seats.
I think without question. I mean, politics is brutal, even if you're on the winning side. So Jonathan Ashworth, you mentioned, was one of the MPs for Leicester, but in a real surprise, lost out, even though he's been a really prominent member of Sir Keir Starmer's team. Really, even in all the ups and downs of Westminster, all the gossip, all the rumours, there really was not any major sense that he was in trouble in his seat. And his result really was one of the shocks of last night. There's less surprise about Thangam Debonair losing her seat. She would have today been expecting to be Culture Secretary, but she lost out to the Greens. Carla Denyer, their co-leader, mounted a very strong campaign and she won. She is the new MP there, alongside Adrian Ramsey, who's won a seat on the other side of England, over in Waveney Valley in a rural area. So you've got an interesting thing going on with the Greens, one new city seat, one new countryside seat, but two prominent Labour politicians missing out today. You probably can recognise this Labour politician though, Yvette Cooper. very prominent. One of the others who's been in government before. She's been the Shadow Home Secretary all throughout the last couple of years, working for Keir Starmer with that very thorny brief of immigration, of course. One of their rivals' main criticisms of Labour was that if they didn't back the Tories' plan to send illegal immigrants to Rwanda, what would they do with people who tried to come to the UK illegally to claim asylum here? What would they do instead? And there is a huge challenge, of course, for Yvette Cooper now to try to sort out what I think everybody around here would acknowledge is a real problem in the asylum system, real problem in the immigration system. You going to be Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper? I wonder, she just had a little word with that policeman. I wonder if she said, oh, I'm about to be your new boss. But Yvette Cooper, in she goes to see Sir Keir Starmer, and we'd expect her to be the Home Secretary in the next few minutes. But, you know, just a word of caution, until we see the official press releases come down and emerge from Downing Street, none of these things are confirmed until they're confirmed. And those two losses you mentioned, Sophie, do open up a space for some people we might not have expected to be in the Cabinet to get a big job.
Well, watching all of this with us here in the studio is the former Conservative Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng. What is it like for you watching this?
Well, it brings back memories. I mean, that walk takes forever. I mean, you see people just walking up and it seems like a short period, but when you're there, you're always thinking, how am I going to walk and what am I going to wear? And it's quite nerve-wracking.
Talking of short periods, we were talking about your time as Chancellor a little bit earlier, and I asked you, we had to interrupt for the new arrivals. We were asking about to what extent you take responsibility for the Conservatives losing this election, given that they've never really recovered from your mini budget with Liz Truss.
So look, I take some responsibility, but I've said publicly I don't take responsibility for the campaign. I don't take responsibility for the timing of the election. And there were a whole host of things that happened, not only in the campaign, but in the last 18 months, that have led to this very poor result. Now, I think what we did was partially responsible, but if you look at the rise of reform, and you used to have you had a chart there, but reform when I left government were on about 3 or 4%, and they've got, I think, 14 or 15%. So things have happened in the last 18 months that have contributed as well to what has been a disappointing performance.
What was it like for you watching Liz Truss and Therese Coffey both lose their seats overnight?
I think, as someone said earlier, politics is very brutal. I didn't think we'd anticipate. I thought Therese was probably in slightly more danger than Liz. Liz had a huge majority in 2019. I think it was something like 26,000. So it was only really at the end of the campaign that one thought that she might lose. And of course, when she did lose, it was something like 600 votes. And that's just the nature of politics. And we mentioned Jonathan Ashworth. You know, he would have been looking to go into the cabinet, and now he's not even an MP. So it's a very precarious world. But people choose to go into it. I mean, I'm not asking people to feel sorry for politicians.
Have you had any contact with Liz Truss today?
She texted me about, WhatsApp me when I was on air. About
what did she say?
I think she's disappointed that she's lost her seat. And also I was struck by the fact that she didn't make any remarks. And she said that generally in her constituency, the losing candidate doesn't make public remarks.
Let me just explain, because some people watching were surprised that there was no concession speech from her at that count.
Right. That's right. But she said to me, because I was surprised actually when I saw that, and then after I'd made my remarks on television, she said that it wasn't the custom for people who'd lost. And obviously different areas do things differently. And it wasn't the custom for people who'd lost necessarily to make remarks. And I know that some counts that happens because they want to get things through things very quickly.
And why did she lose, do you think?
I think lots of things. I think there was association with her term in government. There was also, I understand, concerns about the fact that, and you always get these concerns, that she wasn't spending enough time maybe in the constituency. That was the rumour. I don't think that was true, but that was the perception. And of course she had a man called James Bagg, who was standing as an independent Tory effectively, so that would have split some of her votes. So there were lots of different
But she was punished
factors.
for her short time in government, wasn't she?
Well, I think it was partly that, but there were other considerations as well. I mean, it's easy now she's lost, to say that was the reason. But I think there were other concerns as well.
How do you think she will handle the humiliation of losing her seat?
Look, it's always very difficult. I mean, we can gleefully, look at politicians and lose, and it's quite entertaining. But I think, from a personal point of view, it's really, really difficult because she's someone who's always wanted to be an MP. I think she's fought something like 6 general elections from when she was in her mid-20s. And this is something that she was very much committed to in terms of public service and being a politician. So I think it'll be very difficult. I think she's very resilient. She'll bounce back in some form or other. She may even want to come back into the House of Commons, but we just have to wait and see.
Did you didn't stand in this election. Did you stand down because you thought you would suffer a similar fate to Liz Truss?
No, I didn't. In fact, we held my seat. I felt that it was time to move on. I'd been done 14 years. I'd done 5 years as an MP, 5 years in government. And I thought that was the right time to move on. And as Michael Gove said, none of us are conscripts, and we dedicate our lives and part of our lives to public service. But it's not something that we have to do indefinitely. And sometimes in life, I've got a young family, I've got a young daughter who's only 2.5. It makes sense to do something else.
You said she messaged you, WhatsApped you today. What do you say back to her?
I said thank you she clarified a point that I had to talk about, namely the fact that she didn't speak to the assembled.
She wanted you to make that clear.
And I said I would make that clear in subsequent broadcasts.
What now for the Conservative Party? Who do you think should be leader? Who would you back?
So this is very difficult. I mean, I don't know who the candidates are, so I can't possibly say who I would back if there isn't a contest.
Well, a lot of them aren't there anymore, are they? The possible
That's
contenders.
Right. I mean,
have
Penny
lost their
Mordaunt
seats.
was a very strong candidate. Grant Shapps, who I regard as a friend, lost his seat. I was very sad to see that. And there were others as well, I think, who lost their seats.
So of the ones that you do know about, though?
I'm not committed to any candidates at the moment. I mean, clearly there are strong contenders. People like Tom Tugendhat, again, he's a personal friend. Kemi Badenoch, I have a lot of respect for. I think Robert Jenrick is making waves. So there'll be a range of people, possibly Jeremy Hunt, I don't know. But we have to wait and see what the field is before we can commit to...
It doesn't sound like Rishi Sunak is going to leave immediately, that there might be a period of... what would you expect, a few weeks, months?
I think he's being really responsible, because one of the problems we had, certainly I think in 2022, when Liz Truss won, and before that, is that we always bounce into these contests. So the previous leader goes, and then we go straight into the contest. I think one of the most effective leadership battles, if you like, leadership contests that we had was when David Cameron took over in 2005. And in that situation, we'd lost the general election in May, and Michael Howard deliberately stayed as leader to make sure that we had a kind of orderly succession. And David Cameron, I think, emerged successfully from that process. If we'd had an immediate contest, he might not have won.
What about Nigel Farage? His stated aim is to take over the Conservative Party.
Well, I'm not sure what Nigel's position is. I mean, on one level he says, well, Richard Tyson said he wants to destroy the Conservative Party, which seems like an odd thing for us to want to bring in someone who wants to destroy our party. At other times, Nigel says he doesn't want anything to do with the Conservative Party, but he doesn't want to destroy us. And then sometimes he says, well, he wants to take over and reshape the centre-right. So I don't really know what his intentions are. And we'll just have to wait and see how he opposes Labour, what his caucus of MPs does. And so that we can, how you work in Parliament is opposition parties come together sometimes to oppose, proposed government legislation. But that's very much on a case-by-case basis. You're not going to agree on everything. And we just have to wait and see how that develops.
There are some senior members of the Conservative Party who think they should be reaching out to reform and bringing them in. There are others who wouldn't touch them with a barge pole, which begs the question, can the Conservative Party, as we know it, survive going forward?
I think it can. I mean, looking at the polls yesterday, at the beginning of yesterday, the morning, they were suggesting that Labour would get a 250 majority, some of them, 260, I mean, really, really large majorities.
Well, 174 is pretty large.
Yeah, but it's not. It is, but it's not a record. It's almost the same as 1997, but not quite. A lot of the MRP polls were saying that we were going to have double-digit MPs. Now, 121 isn't very many MPs, but I think it does form a base on which you can rebuild.
Kwasi
So we're
Kwarteng.
still keeping an eye there on Downing Street for now. Kwasi Kwarteng, thank you very much indeed. Should we see how Laura's getting on in
She has been
Downing
up
Street?
all night. Not a moment's sleep.
To be
Laura,
fair,
I think
Laura
you're
hasn't
about
actually slept since 2003, so it's no surprise.
I think you're about to leave us,
Well, I
though,
haven't
Laura,
slept very-
actually, after your marathon stint.
I think I am. There's a bit of a lull in the appointments of people coming up the street, although actually I think I can just see, as soon as I said that, Jonathan Reynolds, who we expect is going to be the business secretary, that is the last, perhaps the last one for a while, because there has been a bit of a lull, but I think if we just show you the shot, there he is, Jonathan Reynolds. He's going to be the business secretary we expect. He's part of a very close team around Keir Starmer of those next generation, I would say, Jonathan Reynolds, Wes Streeting, Rachel Reeves, all very, very tight. Walking up to Downing Street now, but we have also, John and Sophie, our first confirmation that Angela Rayner is indeed the Deputy Prime Minister. That announcement has been made, and as Jonathan Reynolds walks up the street, let's just see if we can confirm her full title. The Right Honourable Angela Rayner will be the Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, and will also be Deputy Prime Minister. So as we would expect, Angela Rayner with that big job and in charge of housing. A smiling Jonathan Reynolds there. Are you going to be the Business Secretary, Mr Reynolds? He looks like he can't believe his luck. There we are, Jonathan Reynolds, an MP in the northwest of England, been a key part of Keir Starmer's team, really slowing down for those shots in front of the photographers to make sure he enjoyed his moment in the limelight. And my goodness, they all do look very eager to get in, very eager to get on. I wonder if they're actually holding them all in there, perhaps for one big first group photograph as a cabinet, because we haven't seen anybody go out yet. And we will in the next while expect them to come out behind me and go through that way, through into the back of the Foreign Office, where they'll for the first time get to perch their posteriors in a snazzy ministerial car before being driven off to their departments and get on with the job of work. Rachel Reeves, I think, is going to, for the choreography of this afternoon, actually come out of number 11 for the first time. So that will be an image that makes history in its own way, with her as the first ever female Chancellor in the United Kingdom. But as we've seen, John and Sophie, in the last 40 minutes or so, Keir Starmer has wasted no time at all in putting together his cabinet, the most senior politicians in the country. We now have, not quite perhaps the full team, but we certainly know who's going to be in those big jobs. They're all inside. A few more of the major cabinet appointments to come. Still the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Secretary of State for Wales, Secretary of State for Scotland, of course, really important jobs in terms of what Keir Starmer called in his speech and made careful note of, the four nations of the United Kingdom united together as one team. So still there are important appointments to come, but those big offices of state absolutely seem clear. But at the back of all of their minds, behind all the elation and all the feelings of celebration that undoubtedly they'll feel all today, is the job ahead of them. At a time when the economy has been so battered, it might be turning, but it has been bleak. The public finances are under such pressure. And as Keir Starmer probably said every single day of this campaign, he absolutely hammered this point too in his speech this afternoon. In his view, in Labour's view, they have a huge job to do to persuade our viewers watching this afternoon, the millions of people who voted for them yesterday, that politics, after all the turmoil, can actually be a force of good, and that when a politician tells you they're going to do something, they can, in actual fact, get it done. It's a tall order.
Laura, their job is just beginning. Yours for today is finally over. I know you've been on air since 10 o'clock last night. I think you can actually get some sleep at last, but you are back again, I know, on Sunday for your show as usual. But thank you very much.
That's right. Well, it gives me at least 24 hours, I don't know, to maybe have a bit of a lie down. But yes, hopefully I'll see everybody on BBC One at 9 o'clock. One more thing.
No.
You can if you must, John. You can if you must.
No. Laura Ginsberg, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy your sleep. We're here in the studio, actually, on outside the Houses of Commons, outside the Houses of Parliament, with Helen McNamara, who worked in the civil service for 20 years. We're looking at images there of Downing Street, the Black Door. We cannot see inside. We had a brief glimpse earlier when Sir Keir Starmer went in as the new Prime Minister. You have worked there for 20 years. You've run election campaigns, 2010, 2015, 2019. You know what is going on. What is happening behind that Black Door?
A lot. So it's the first thing to say. And I can see that looking at it, you think, well, how on earth can it be taking so long to appoint people into the cabinet that you sort of knew the jobs they were going to get anyway? And that's part of what you're seeing happening before you, is this transition between the opposition to the business of governing. Because actually these are substantial conversations that the Prime Minister is probably having with the people he's appointing. So the civil service will have provided for the Prime Minister a little clutch card which will have the key things that they think he should be saying to the new Secretary of State for whichever department it is. There'll probably be something in there about the urgent legislative priorities. It will be more likely than not the kind of first bilateral conversation that the Prime Minister has with an individual person with his cabinet, and he'll be doing that in front of his Chief of Staff and with the civil service. So it's not just a kind of handshake and a thank you very much. It can be quite an important foundational conversation for how they're going to work together over time. And then there's all the rest of the process that has to follow as well. So I can see it can be a bit frustrating, but it takes time because it's actually substantial business that's going on behind that door.
I'm guessing nothing can ever prepare you for the moment that you actually walk through that door.
Do you know, I don't think it does, and it's one of the magical things. It's been a real privilege at different jobs and at different points in my life to be the person that, after the Prime Minister has appointed somebody into a cabinet position, then it's been my job sometimes to go and talk to them about and do their propriety and ethics checks and all of those things, and just to be part of that moment where someone's life is really changed, and you can literally see that kind of realisation that they have, partly that they've made it, that they've got the kind of big top job, but also the kind of dawning realisation of the responsibility that they have and the public service that they are now signed up to. And you start those initial conversations and you run through the list of the things that you know are kind of in the in tray for that minister, and you can see literally on their faces sometimes the kind of realisation that that's them now, and then as soon as they leave number 10 they're back at the desk and they've got to start doing the job.
Their lives will never be the same again. And the pace of these arrivals today suggests that Sir Keir Starmer wants to really hit the ground running, which he might think works politically because voters can be impatient. But for the civil service, that's a real challenge, isn't it? That if the pace of change is to be fast.
Well, you need your cabinet in place. I mean, frankly, you know, it's part of the thing that, I mean, everybody comments a lot about this transition and how fast it is, and that's true. But also you do need, by the end of today, to have appointed most of your cabinet appointments, if not all of them, and ideally have done, not to put pressure on my former colleagues, ideally to have broken records from previously. But you do, they're big jobs and they need to be filled, and you need these Secretaries of State in their departments this afternoon, over the weekend, tomorrow, and getting started with the work.
Do stay with us. We're going to go now to Christian Fraser, though, because it was a bad night for the Scottish National Party, and Christian has been looking at the state of what has been happening overnight in Scotland. Christian.
Yeah, I was saying a little earlier, Sophie, I actually think Labour had their best result in Scotland. I'll show you why in a second. Disastrous, of course, for the SNP. There are 2 seats to declare still. One is South Basildon, the other is in Inverness. And I should just say that on our forecast, we have that down as an SNP hold. People aren't so sure about that. The Liberal Democrats are feeling pretty confident about Inverness, so we might have to take one off the SNP and put it in the Liberal Democrat column, which would mean that they lost 3/4 of their seats in single digits. That would be quite an extraordinarily poor night for the SNP. But really, this is why I want to talk about the Labour performance in Scotland, because although it was only up 2 or 3 points across England and Wales, and across the UK, in Scotland, it's actually almost double, from 19%, around 19% in 2019, up to 36%. So if you were going to get a Labour recovery, 26 of their target seats were in Scotland. They've done far better than that. So they'd be looking at Glasgow, across the central belt, North Lanarkshire, South Lanarkshire, in Rutherglen, out to the west, out to Renfrewshire. And if I change it, you'll see it's pretty good. For Labour, especially good in Glasgow. They've taken all 6 Glasgow seats. They've picked up some of the old coal and steel mining places out there in North Lanarkshire. Lothian East, Douglas Alexander, remember him, back as an MP for Labour, formerly in government with Labour. Look at this also, though. This is quite interesting. Still blue on the board. So although Scotland had been, although they'd been wiped out in Wales, the Conservatives, in Scotland they have 5 of their 6 seats. And that's because Reform, as you'll see as we go through this, don't perform that well north of the border. So let me show you a few seats. This one in Glasgow West was the SNP's safest seat in Glasgow. You can see it's almost a direct swing from the SNP to Labour. So that one going towards Labour. And then this one here, very much great satisfaction to Sir Ed Davey, this one. Do you remember back in 2019, Joe Swinson lost this seat? It's been reformed in mid-Dumbartonshire, but the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, absolutely in celebratory mood in 2019 when this one went SNP. Well, that's the revenge of the Liberal Democrats just north of Glasgow in mid-Dumbartonshire. Really strange interest, actually, in West Aberdeenshire. Now, one of the things that we've been seeing in the Conservative seats where the Conservatives, in all 6 seats, the SNP were running second. So this was a direct battle between the Conservatives and the SNP in the Conservative seats, and it really depended on whose vote fell faster. So in this one, you see that actually it was the Conservative vote holding up better than the SNP vote, which is why they've held West Aberdeenshire. But in this one, up there in Aberdeenshire North, Douglas Ross, the Scottish Conservative leader who parachuted himself into that seat in place of David Dogood, who was in hospital, he lost because actually the SNP vote share in that one was going down slower than the Conservatives. So it just really is quite remarkable, actually, when you look at Reform vote, even though that's up 15%, it's not enough, actually, in some of the other seats that the Conservatives were battling to take seats off the Conservatives, which is why, actually, their seat share in Scotland has held up reasonably well.
Thank you very much indeed. Fascinating, is it? So many individual stories in every seat. And that's a good point to go to Glasgow. And Nicky Campbell's there. Nicky.
Yeah, that was so interesting from Christian. Hi, Sophie. Hi, John. Katie Hunter, our Scotland correspondent, is here. Some interesting stuff there from Christian Fraser, and he was mentioning Glasgow. Let's start with Labour, get the bigger picture here. Glasgow, absolutely vital for the Labour comeback, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think what happened in Glasgow, Nicky, tells a story about what happened in constituencies across Scotland, doesn't it? You know, before this election was called, all of the Glasgow seats were held by the SNP. People waking up this morning, all 6 seats won by Labour. The cities turned red. And that's the story in constituencies across Scotland, you know, Labour taking votes from the SNP. But, you know, on the Labour front, I think their win has been bigger than most people expected. You know, I remember speaking to a Labour staffer before the election was called through in the Scottish Parliament, and he was saying, you know, if we get to the mid-20s, we'll be delighted. Well, here's 2 figures that kind of sum up the Labour campaign. They're sitting on 37 seats in Scotland. Last general election in 2019, they won just 1 single Scottish seat in Scotland. So the turnaround for Labour has been huge, hasn't it?
It's amazing, and it's kind of back to the future, isn't it? Back to the past, back to, I mean, this is what it used to be like when Labour reigned supreme and the Scottish National Party, maybe in the 80s, were getting, in the 90s, 6 seats, something like that. And then they had that massive surge forward. So where did it go wrong for the SNP? Why has it? Because when the exit poll came out, I know a lot of people around here, the BBC in Glasgow, and indeed on Clive Murray was saying it, and Laura Kunsberg was saying it. It's not going to be quite as bad as this exit poll says for the SNP, but it was.
Yeah, we were just discussing this earlier, weren't we? When that exit poll dropped at 10 o'clock last night, I've spent a fair bit of time on the SNP campaign trail, especially over the last week.
A shock to them.
Well, I was texting people saying it's not going to be that bad. You know, the exit poll, they'll do better than the exit poll is suggesting. But as for where it went wrong, I guess it's probably different for different voters, isn't it? You know, we've got to remember that the SNP have been in power at Holyrood for 17 years now. This was a Westminster election, sure, but of course devolved issues were coming up, weren't they? Like health, like education. And the SNP's opponents in Scotland were very critical of that record. Now, the SNP was shouting about its record. It was trying to talk about things like free prescriptions, free bus travel for under 22. So the SNP's record was definitely an issue. Independence, that was page 1 line 1 of the manifesto. I think some independent supporters would have liked to have seen that more prominent, others less so.
Fascinating. Thank you very much for that. Ed Middleband has just gone into 10 Downing Street, so we'll go back to Sophie and John to pick up on his potential new job as the Secretary of State for the Environment, one might think.
Nicky Campbell, thank you very much. Let's go straight to Faisal Islam, our economics editor, who spoke to Rachel Reeves. She has just been confirmed as the new Chancellor, Britain's first female Chancellor. You were talking to her just last night, though, weren't you?
Yes, and we're expecting her to come out of number 11 at any moment and make her way over to His Majesty's Treasury as the first female Chancellor of the Exchequer that the UK has ever had. That official confirmation of that, as you said, has just come through. And I did catch up with her, it was actually this morning, talking to her at her account in Leeds about economics mainly. And I asked her about, exactly, we've been talking about this Ming Vase strategy of very carefully trying to get to the election, which proved successful politically. But what we're hearing from business leaders is maybe the Ming Vase needs to be chucked over their shoulder and they need bold action to get the economy to grow strongly again, and they need the economy to grow strongly again. So I asked her about that, and she said that they need the private sector to invest because there isn't much money around. So let's have a little listen to that clip from the now Chancellor of the Exchequer talking to me in the early hours of this morning.
I know the scale of the challenge that I am likely to inherit if I become Chancellor. There's not a huge amount of money there, and so what we need to do is unlock private sector investment, and that's why our plans on reforming the planning system, on reform to our pensions system, on reform to our skills system to give young people the skills that they need to succeed and businesses the workers that they need to be competitive. We've drawn up those plans with business, and we want in government to be able to enact them with the support of business too.
Now, you're hearing a lot from Rachel Reeves about planning reform. That's not the most interesting necessary backwater of the economy. But the reason why they're talking about that an awful lot is because if they change the rules around building big projects and houses, they think they can attract tens of billions, hundreds of billions of pounds worth of investment. And that's the money, she says, that isn't there in the Treasury that I'm standing right next to. There isn't a note this time. I don't think there would be a note left by any outgoing Treasury ministers, as there famously was in 2010, that there's no money left. But she has made that sort of comment, and it shows the constraints she's acting under when she emerges from number 11 for the first time and makes her way over to the Treasury to address the staff here as the first female Chancellor of the Exchequer the United Kingdom has had, and one with big challenges ahead to get the economy growing again.
Faisal Islam, our economics editor. Thank you. Well, let's talk while we wait on those images to see the moment that Rachel Reeves does come out outside number 11 for the first time. We've got Helen McNamara with us still, who was the former Deputy Cabinet Secretary, worked in the civil service for 20 years. They have had what are called access talks, haven't they? So they get an early indication, not very long, but of what the state of the government, the finances is.
Yes, so the permanent secretary of each department will have met their shadow equivalent, the shadow spokesperson, over the last few months, and they'll have had 2 or 3, maybe 4 conversations. So there's been some contact, but not very much, and definitely not with the whole department. So what's happening in Whitehall right now, and probably what these officials in the Treasury are busy sweating over, is thinking about how they can be ready to impress their new boss with their readiness to implement her big ideas, but also they'll be really, really obsessing about the small details. And my friend Clea and I had the privilege of interviewing lots of people who'd gone into ministerial jobs from the outside, and it was fascinating to listen to the little details and how much they were noticed. So when David Cameron came into Downing Street in 2010, they'd spotted exactly the kind of mints that he liked on the campaign trail, and the team found that the office was full of these mints. And it's those tiny things that you're doing to try to win friends.
Another big name coming down Downing Street as you're talking to us, Lisa Nandy. I think Leila Nathu is there waiting outside number 10.
Sophie, Lisa Nandy is just walking in behind me. She is the shadow at the moment
International Development Minister. Interesting to see if this becomes a Secretary of State role. Remember, the Department for International Development was a separate one before it was fused with the Foreign Office. So interesting to see whether there are any changes there and whether that gets siphoned off again into a different department. So Lisa Nandy becoming the next person to go in the door. Interesting, they all are still in there. Remember, they've all got to get their official photographs taken for when the announcements are made. They are trickling out now officially on social media. I think I can see Ian Murray there waiting at the gates just down the road. I think he's still waiting for his turn to walk up the street. He is expected to be the Scotland Secretary. There we go, we can see Ian Murray there just waiting his turn, waiting to be ushered up the street. He will be taking charge of a revitalised Labour Party presence in Scotland. Remember, absolutely, Ian Murray is on his way up there. You know, a huge victory that Labour have secured in Scotland, absolutely transformed his party's fortunes there. So Ian Murray expected to be the Scotland Secretary. He has been the shadow Scotland Secretary. Yes, you're spotting them for you. There is Louise Haigh, currently the shadow Transport Secretary. She has formed an orderly queue. So Ian Murray, there, the Scotland Secretary. Just something worth pointing out is that many of the shadow cabinet ministers have been in their post for years, and that really does contrast with some of the turnover that we've had in cabinet ministers under the previous Conservative government. So Ian Murray there going in, expected to be appointed the Scotland Secretary, a position that he has been shadowing for some time. Louise Haigh there in the bright green trousers, if we can see her at the gates. She is currently the shadow Transport Secretary. Again, I don't think we're going to get any surprises in terms of what role she is expected to get in government. So expected to be appointed as the Transport Secretary, really important role there. Obviously, one of the central pledges of the Labour Party in this election has been to take railways back into public ownership as the franchises expire. So it's something that she will have to preside over. Clearly, the unravelling of HS2, the second leg that was cancelled by Rishi Sunak, and the funds that were reallocated around the country. Angela Rayner now coming out of number 10. Angela Rayner, thumbs up there. I don't know if you can see Angela Rayner has just come out the door of number 10. There she is, crossing the path of Louise Haigh. Just going there now, Angela Rayner out of number 10. Thumbs up, saying she felt very good. She is the first cabinet minister to come out of that door at number 10. Louise Haigh there going in. Brightly coloured trousers, brightly coloured hair there. But Angela Rayner, we have just seen the first going out. I didn't know whether we might expect a group shot of all the ministers, but it looks like Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, Secretary of State for Levelling Up, has left number 10.
Thank you. It's all happening so fast. Helen McNamara, you're 20 years in the civil service. Was it ever this quick?
Speedy.
It really is. I mean, they are queuing up. They're being, here we are. They're literally queuing up. Lucy Powell coming as well now. They're being it's choreographed, isn't it? One after the other.
I was even wondering whether they might be having a cabinet meeting this afternoon. But the fact that Angela Rayner has left suggests not. But Helen McNamara, you've been there at the highest levels of the civil service on days like this, as well as appointing the cabinet. What else does Sir Keir Starmer have to do on his first day?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, as has been talked about before, there's the security briefings that he needs to have. The Prime Minister from now. So, as well as appointing his cabinet, he'll be meeting the team who give him his security briefings. There may well be urgent issues that he needs to be briefed on during the day today. So, in the middle of doing all these ministerial appointments, he will have to start getting into the business of taking decisions or being briefed on things. He's got the NATO summit next week. He's got a lot of actual business of governing to get on with.
He even has to write letters, doesn't he, to the commanders of the 4 nuclear submarines in the UK, and that's one of the first tasks he's given in the event that the UK, they lost contact with the UK, what they should do.
So it's one of the things which is, part of our democracy, is that every Prime Minister should in effect give these instructions.
Rachel Reeves, the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, the UK's first female Chancellor, just leaving Downing Street as well. The cameras can hardly keep up with this frenetic activity. Liz Kendall now arriving.
And Rachel Reeves going
through to the Treasury. I guess this is where they all meet their teams, isn't it? Also here, Nick Watt, BBC's editor from Newsnight. Nick, what are the political considerations for Keir Starmer as he puts this cabinet together in terms of personalities, in terms of loyalties, in terms of private politics?
Well, I imagine what we might see in the next hour is what is called the Quad, which is the top 4 members of the cabinet, which is Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, Angela Rayner as Deputy Prime Minister, Rachel Reeves as Chancellor, and probably some very big job, maybe Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster heading the Cabinet Office, going to Pat McFadden. They will drive the cabinet, and the reason why Keir Starmer wants to do that is he knows he's got to move really quickly because expectations are really high. And if you are not going to put up tax, you're not going to borrow more, and you're going to bring down debt, there's only one way that you can make things better, which is to grow the economy. And to do that, you've got to move really quickly, planning reform, all that sort of stuff.
Pat McFadden, who's just been announced the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster.
Well, there we are. Yes, absolutely. And he has...
What does that mean exactly? What does that job involve?
Well, Helen would know that job. You are basically in the engine room of government, in the Cabinet Office, making the Cabinet, making the departments drive, pushing the Prime Minister's will. That slot can be a graveyard. Do you remember Jack Cunningham? Didn't work for him. Or it can really work and you can really drive. It depends, Helen would know this better than me, on the nature of your relationship with the Prime Minister, your credibility in Whitehall. Pat McFadden used to be Tony Blair's political secretary. He sat in the cabinet. He was Peter Mandelson's deputy in the business department because Mandelson was a lord. He was in the cabinet. Pat McFadden, big relationship with Keir Starmer. Don't forget, Pat McFadden is the man who stood behind Jeremy Corbyn and said, this man is a threat to our country's security. Big credibility with Keir Starmer.
Tell us more about his job then, Helen.
So yeah, when it works well, the CDL, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, is the person who in effect is the Prime Minister's presence on earth across all of domestic policy while the Prime Minister is doing all the rest of their job. So when it works well, it's a brilliant way of kind of making sure that what the Prime Minister wants to happen is happening everywhere across Whitehall. So Pat McFadden, I expect to be yes on the big ideas, yes on the delivery, but also relentlessly following up and making sure that departments are doing all of the things that they're supposed to be doing.
And this idea of a quad is new, isn't it? So it's a sort of a cabinet above a cabinet.
Well, let's see what it actually turns out to be in practice, I would say. So there was a quad during the coalition era, but it wasn't the kind of formal part of the cabinet decision-making kind of architecture, and it tended to be used more in extremis rather than as a positive, to be honest. So I sort of think,
by the sounds of it, is going to be used to
cherish the thought that this will be a formal arrangement, because of course we have cabinet government in this country, and they all sit down and they all make these joint decisions. But the reality is, Keir Starmer's got to move fast because he's got to get that growth going.
Playing I Spy on the cabinet, I think it was Angela Smith going in just then, wasn't it? I mean, it all comes down to communication, doesn't it? Those relationships between government and Helen in government, you've seen when it doesn't work.
So yeah,
how do you hold it together beyond day one?
Totally obsessed about structures, and actually civil servants are usually very good at being totally obsessed about structures. In the end, it's about what's the team that the Prime Minister can build around himself, and how do the ministers want to work together, and are they going to be able to put aside their departmental interests and try and work together on the things that really matter, which is where this idea of missions-led government, which is like another level of nerdery perhaps, but is a really interesting way potentially of restructuring some of the ways that Whitehall works to try to make that delivery happen much faster than it has done.
How easy is that to do, though? Restructure Whitehall?
Extremely difficult.
And how long? But how long could it take?
Well, I mean, the only thing I would say is that you have in Keir Starmer and the team around him people who have just delivered quite a huge change in their own party over a 4.5-5 year period, and they're experienced in actually making change happen and what that feels like and what you get right and what you get wrong and how you stick at it and you make things different. So I would have thought, actually, interestingly, they are quite equipped as a team to look across at the public sector and actually make the things they want to happen.
Of course, that team includes Sue Gray, the name that people watching will remember as Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff now, but formerly a civil servant, investigated Partygate. How crucial is she going to be in that link between government, politicians and civil service now?
Well, just as Tony Blair had a great advantage in having Jonathan Powell as part of his close team, Keir Starmer has that with Sue Gray, who can translate the civil service to Keir Starmer and his new team better than anyone else, I'm sure.
So diplomatically put. Oh, to be a fly in the wall. When Sue Gray walks into a room and she's sitting there with Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, they, how can we put this diplomatically, don't exactly get on. And
They have
Sue
history.
Gray, yeah, Sue Gray believes that Simon Gray blocked her from becoming a permanent secretary. So it will be very, very interesting to see how that relationship lasts. Sue Gray is close to the Prime Minister, credibility with the Prime Minister. What Whitehall loves is people who have the writ of a powerful Prime Minister. That's what Sue Gray has. That is what Simon Case does not have.
We have a new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy. That's just been announced.
Yes, now that is very interesting because I reported on Newsnight last week that there were some in the Foreign Office who were a bit nervous about David Lammy because he has been highly critical in the past of Donald Trump, described him as a racist. There was a worry about whether that might be a difficult appointment. I had people from the Foreign Office saying, no, 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 we've seen David Lammy. He interacts really well with Republicans. He's met the Trump team. I spoke to somebody called Elbridge Colby, who was in the Trump administration. He's being talked about as a future national security advisor to Trump. He was highly complimentary about David Lammy, said much better than David Cameron, because David Cameron, he said, comes to Washington and lectures us about Ukraine. David Lammy comes to Washington and listens to us.
What about another David Miliband? Not an MP, but there have been rumours that maybe Keir Starmer would bring him back with a peerage or something.
There have been lots of rumours about that. I mean, it is difficult for a government at the start to put people in the Lords and make them Secretaries of State. That's what you tend to do at the end, when you sort of pull the emergency cord and bring in Peter Mandelson. You pull the emergency cord and you bring in David Cameron. At the beginning, when you have a fresh mandate, you want people with those personal mandates sitting round your cabinet
And we've got
table.
two more for you. Yvette Cooper, Home Secretary, John Healey, Defence Secretary. That was expected, wasn't it?
No great surprise there at all. John Healey, very close relationship with David Lammy. They recently went to Ukraine together. They had quite a fun picture of them at, I think it was at Krakow Airport, waiting to get their Wizz Air flight back to the UK, having taken the train from Kyiv. And the joke was, don't think you guys are going to be taking Wizz Air for much longer. Yvette Cooper, not a surprise as Home Secretary. Not the warmest of relationship with Keir Starmer, but Keir Starmer rates her, realises what a serious figure is. And it was interesting to see Yvette Cooper walk through the door because she was one of the few members of this new cabinet who was a full member of the last Labour cabinet. She was Work and Pensions Secretary when Gordon Brown stopped being Prime Minister in 2010. Obviously, Ed Miliband, we've seen him going in. He was the Climate Change Secretary at the end of the Gordon Brown administration. So that's an interesting sort of element of continuity.
Well, one of the big figures who went last night, of course, Liz Truss, the former Prime Minister. We can go to Navtej Johal, our correspondent, who is in Liz Truss's constituency, or old constituency, now.
Yes, Sophie, welcome to Swaffham, a beautiful historic market town in the heart of the Norfolk Southwest constituency, which has been true blue forever. It's been Conservative for many, many decades. In fact, the MP Liz Truss, who stopped being the MP, of course, in the early hours of this morning, started being the MP here in 2010. In 2019, she had a 69% vote share with a 24,000 majority. But all of that has been turned on its head, turned upside down, when this morning it was announced that she had lost to her Labour rival by just 630 votes. So how did the former Prime Minister become the former Member of Parliament for Norfolk South West? Well, we've been speaking to lots of people around the town here, to people in the indoor market, in the cafes, and even up there at the Conservative Club. And the impression that we're getting, the messages that we're getting are very, very clear. There was a lack of enthusiasm for both Liz Truss personally and for the Conservatives more widely. Let's dig a little bit deeper into that by speaking to some of the people who live around here. We've got Sue, who owns this cafe, Tutankhamun's, in Swaffham. Sue, you voted Conservative all your life, haven't you?
Yes, I have, yes.
So what changed? Why did you want to vote elsewhere yesterday?
Because voter no confidence in the Conservative Party now. They haven't delivered what they've said, and you know, the country's in a poor state at the moment, I think.
And what do you make of Liz Truss as an MP, now the former MP?
Yeah, she tried, but didn't try hard enough, I suppose. But yeah, so I was going to vote for Reform Party. But
And did her brief time as Prime Minister, did that affect the way you thought of her, the way you voted?
yes, yeah, it did really. Yeah.
In what way?
I just didn't think she was the right person for the job. You know, she didn't really come over as doing anything for the country. She wasn't a strong enough woman, I don't think.
And as you say, you voted for reform. You now have a Labour MP. How do you feel about that?
Not very good. I would never vote Labour in my life, but we're stuck with it now. Let's hope they can do something, prove themselves that they're going to do something for the country.
Thank you, Sue. Well, let's move over here as well. We've got Sharon, who also voted yesterday. Sharon, tell me a little bit about how you feel about Liz Truss, first of all.
Well, I never really trusted Liz Truss because of the state of the country. So that's why I voted Reform.
When you say state of the country, what specifically do you mean?
Like immigration and the way things, like imports and exports. And I mean, I work and I know that we have trouble exporting and importing things. So, yeah, we need to get the country back on its feet. Yeah.
And what about Liz Truss as a local MP?
I can't say I really know her because I haven't lived here very long. So, I don't really know much about her. So.
And her time as Prime Minister, did that affect the way you thought about her?
Yeah. She was tried to do too much too quick, yeah? But it didn't work, did it?
Now you have a Labour MP. What are your hopes for that and for the Labour government more widely?
They do what they say they're going to do and get back on the NHS and all the things which they say they're going to do and help us back on our feet, yeah?
Sharon, thank you. Well, just some of the views that we've been getting all day here in Swaffham. As I said earlier, I was at the Conservative Club and there it was a very sombre mood. People, again, who had voted Conservative for years, for decades, have been party members, saying to me that for the first time yesterday, they voted for another party. So this is, as we know, not just a Portillo moment. It seems to, in some ways, trump that, be symbolic of what's been happening across the country over the last 24 hours.
Nav, it feels from the people you're speaking to like people are exhausted by the last 6 weeks and kind of shell-shocked by what they've seen overnight.
Yes, that is something that's coming across as well, and particularly with regards to Liz Truss's campaign. There have been a couple of moments over the last 6 weeks that people have pointed towards in terms of maybe why she hasn't picked up the votes she has in the past. Remember, she had a 24,000 majority coming into this election, but over the last 6 weeks, people have told me that she missed a key hustings that took place here a couple of weeks ago, that her posters, her banners, her flyers haven't been as visible as they have been in the past. There was also strong opposition from a number of areas. Reform, you've heard a moment ago, obviously Labour won, Terry Jeremy, the candidate, won this seat for Labour, and also a strong independent candidate, a local farmer here as well, also took votes away from Liz Truss too. So yes, a level of exhaustion. I think there's a relief to some extent as well that not only is the election over, but that Liz Truss's time as the MP here has come to an end. You know, yesterday I was listening to an interview that she did with our colleague Nick Robinson several years ago now, and she talked about Britain being a pro-change country. And to her detriment and to Labour's delight, certainly here in Norfolk South West, she has, on that point anyway, been proven emphatically correct.
Navtej Johal, thank you very much for joining us. Let's go and talk to Christian Fraser now, because it was a terrible night last night for the Conservatives in Wales, wiped out in Wales after their gains in 2019. Christian.
Yeah, they did pretty well in Wales in 2019. I was just saying to our cameraman, incidentally, the weather in our virtual studio better than it is out on Downing Street. But let's have a look at the vote in Wales. And yes, although we were talking just in the last hour, weren't we, about a good performance for Labour in Scotland, almost doubling their vote share north of the border. In Wales, not such a good night. Their vote share actually fell 4% on 2019. A couple of reasons for that. Of course, Labour are in power in the Senate in Cardiff, and so they're judged on their record in health and education. And also there was that vote, don't forget, that vote of no confidence which Vaughan Gething, the First Minister, lost just as the campaign started. So not a great night in terms of vote share for Labour, but absolutely fantastic in terms of the seats they took. And the reason for that is that, and that is the Conservative vote share literally halving in Wales. So before the election, we knew there were a clutch of seats up on the North Welsh coast, which Conservatives won in 2019, the likes of Clwyd North, Wrexham, Clwyd East, which were in danger with a 5% swing. And if I click this, you'll see that actually they lost all of them. In fact, the only one that didn't go to Labour was this one, Innismore, which we'll talk about in a second. But some big results there. Monmouthshire, David T.C. Davis, the Welsh Secretary, being taken out in Monmouthshire just alongside the English border. Let's have a look at some of those results. So one of those seats I talked about, Clwyd North there up on the north coast, you can see that although Labour's vote is going down, it is Reform that has taken a massive chunk out of the Conservative vote. And that is really the problem. We've seen it all across the country. John Curtis has been telling us that in 2/3 of the seat that the Conservatives were defending and lost, it is because of that Reform vote. And you see it very clearly there in Clwyd North, which is part of the Red Wall. What about this one? You'll remember this name, I think. Craig Williams, former PPS for Rishi Sunak, who was sitting in that big rural seat in Montgomeryshire. He had I think it was a 15,000 majority. And you can see that there's a 20% swing from Conservative to Labour. He was the one who admitted and then apologised for betting on the date of the election campaign, and he certainly paid the price. Look at that, Reform taking more out of the vote than the Conservatives. Let's talk about Plaid, because they had a very good night. This is actually Carmarthenshire. You can see Simon Hart, the Chief Whip, taken out here by Plaid Cymru. Wales actually lost quite a lot of seats in the boundary review, so they went down from 40 to 32. And Plaid did worse than anybody because they had 4 seats, but only 2 nominally ahead of the vote. Well, they picked this one up, and actually they finished with 4 on the night because of this one. This is a genuine 3-way marginal, and this is a really good result for someone who works in the nuclear industry, Llanos Medi, up there in Innismore. Fantastic constituency, this, because it's, of course, Anglesey. The boundaries of this constituency have never changed since 1535, since King Henry VIII. They've been sending a parliamentarian to Westminster in 500 years, and Llanos Medi will be the next one. So a really good result for Plaid up there in Innismore.
Christian Fraser, thank you very much for that from the latest from Wales. And while you were speaking, we've just got our first comments from the new Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. This is what she had to say.
It is such an honour to be here today as the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I know what a responsibility that brings to guide our economy through uncertain times, to restore stability in an age of insecurity, to build prosperity that draws on the talents of working people. The central mission of this government will be to restore economic growth. During the election, that was the Labour Party mission. It is now our national mission.
Nick Watt is here with us. She's addressing there her new colleagues, her new civil servants in the Treasury, and she wants to get on with the job.
Yes, absolutely. She wants to show that they're going to hit the ground running. She wants to show to the financial markets you are going to have stability. And I make this prediction, this Labour Chancellor and this Labour Prime Minister are going to have a very, very good working relationship, unlike Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, and that will make a big difference. Big thing about Rachel Reeves, she's a big fan of Earl Grey tea. Her hen do, everyone had to sum her up in 3 words. Her mother said, beautiful, fantastic and clever, and her best friend piped up and said, no, Earl Grey tea.
So the Treasury needs to get the new tea bags in.
Absolutely, and the right sort.
OK, good stuff.
Thank you very much, and
All
stay
kinds of
with
insights.
us. Well, let's give you an upsum of what has been happening, because it's been a very long night and a long day. So much has happened in the past, what is it, not even 24 hours. But good afternoon. Sir Keir Starmer is the UK's new Prime Minister after a landslide victory for Labour in the general election.
Our country has voted decisively for change, for national renewal, and a return of politics to public service.
Sir Keir entered Downing Street to cheers from his supporters, promising that change would begin immediately. The Prime Minister has begun appointing his cabinet. As we just saw, Rachel Reeves has been named as the first female Chancellor.
I'm not promising you that it will be easy. There is a long road ahead. It comes with a great weight of responsibility. I embrace it.
Angela Rayner is named Deputy Prime Minister, David Lammy is Foreign Secretary, and Yvette Cooper has been appointed Home Secretary as the big cabinet jobs are dished out.
For the Conservatives, it was a night and a day of pain, an historic number of seats lost. As he left Downing Street for the final time as Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak said he had heard the anger of voters.
I am sorry. I have given this job my all, but you have sent a clear signal that the government of the United Kingdom must change, and yours is the only judgment that matters.
With former Conservative Prime Minister Liz Truss and a record number of other senior politicians losing their seats, Rishi Sunak says he will step down as party leader, but he will not do that immediately.
In Scotland, the SNP are down to just 9 MPs, losing dozens of their seats to Labour. The First Minister says it has been a tough night during a difficult period for his party.
The party's filled with British citizens. Well, this is what I do, divide and rule my ancestors. Now you're trying to divide and rule this country.
And that was the moment that hecklers disrupted a Reform UK event in London this afternoon after Nigel Farage's party secured 4 seats and more than 4 million votes overnight.
Good afternoon from Westminster with Sophie, Raworth and John Kay. We are here on College Green, right outside the Houses of Parliament, where those new MPs will soon be heading to take their places on the green benches in the House of Commons. Many of them will never have stepped foot inside there before. It is really a situation of all change in Parliament. Apparently, actually, Labour are going to have so many MPs, there won't be room for all of them, all 412 of them, on the government's own benches.
It is extraordinary. Nick Watt is with us, Newsnight's political editor. It is extraordinary, really, and you just stand back and reflect on the size of change that we have witnessed overnight.
Well, and also, let's not forget, I'm now going to put my neck out and I'd say, personally, this is a bigger achievement by Keir Starmer than the Tony Blair achievement. Everyone said, oh, Tony Blair, the country loved him, he got a bigger majority than this. Don't forget, with Tony Blair, it took 3 leaders and 3 parliaments to get Labour from its devastating defeat in 1983 to victory in 1997. Keir Starmer, 1 person, 1 parliament. And his problem is, what he needed to do to become leader of the Labour Party was the exact opposite of what he needed to do to become Prime Minister. That has been messy, it has looked difficult, and that's why he faced such difficulty in the campaign about, did you support Jeremy Corbyn, did you not? But that is an extraordinary achievement in 1 parliament to go to the worst defeat in 90 years to this.
Yeah, I mean, it is extraordinary to think that less than 5 years ago we were sitting here talking about Boris Johnson's big majority of 80 and the fact that he was probably going to be in power or could be in power for a decade. So I guess that's why Keir Starmer's achievement is all the more remarkable. And yet when you scratch below the surface, I mean, 412 MPs is enormous. It's a big majority. And yet Labour's share of the vote is 34%, which means that there are vulnerabilities there.
Well, you think of Tony Blair in 2005. He had, I think it was a 60-seat majority on around about 36% of the vote. If you have a substantial majority in there on just over a third of the vote, then you face a challenge. So, yes, a remarkable achievement, but you can see that the dangers that lie there. That first past the post is producing stability in Parliament, but potentially instability in the politics, the wider politics, where Reform UK have a higher percentage than the Liberal Democrats, but a tiny number of seats. And Nigel Farage out the blocks today saying the next election in 5 years' time, we're not just coming after the Conservative vote, we're coming after the Labour vote. And don't forget also that the Labour Party lost some pretty big people to independent candidates.
Darren Jones walking up Downing Street right now. We've also had confirmed that Wes Streeting is Darren Jones, Shadow Chief Secretary of the Treasury, I must just say, but we've also had confirmed that Wes Streeting has been appointed Health Secretary, Bridget Phillipson has been appointed, not surprisingly, the Education Secretary, and Ed Miliband has been appointed the Energy Security and Net Zero Security
No surprises there, and Wes Streeting is an illustration of what I was saying. 500 votes he won by in what should be an Ilford North safe seat, and it was from one of those independent candidates campaigning on Gaza and how the Labour Party was too slow, those candidates would say, in the autumn in calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. That was an incredible shock to Wes Streeting, to the Labour leadership, and that shows the challenge coming down the line. But for the moment, in Cabinet as Health and Social Care Secretary, I imagine Darren Jones will be Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Deputy effectively to Rachel Reeves.
So apart from appointing his new Cabinet, the new Prime Minister also has to take endless phone calls and decide which order he's going to make phone calls in and who he will speak to from leaders right around the world. And they've also been giving their reactions to his success, his victory overnight. The French President, Emmanuel Macron, has said, congratulations, Sir Keir Starmer, on your victory. The Ukrainian President, Zelensky, has praised Starmer on what he called a convincing election victory. And the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, also congratulated him as well.
We have this from the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. He's extended what he calls heartfelt congratulations and best wishes on what he called a remarkable victory for Keir Starmer. And the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, called it an historic election victory. Keir Starmer's probably thinking, you put them all on Twitter, why don't you just do that and you don't have to interrupt me with phone calls.
Exactly, yes. You'll now have to talk to them all as well. We're here as well with Pippa Creer from The Guardian, political editor of The Guardian. Did you expect this result?
I think all of us, because we've all been following the polls and talking to the parties, anticipated a Labour victory. But I think we've also got really used to hearing Labour people say, you know, no, you can't take anything for granted until all the votes are counted. And lots of them are sort of, I guess, haunted by the ghosts of the 1992 general election, when the polls suggested that Labour was marginally ahead, and yet Neil Kinnock, despite all the sort of, you know, there will be upbeat and positive about the prospect of him taking power, lost to John Major. And the second thing, I suppose, is that the Conservatives have been in power for 14 years, and even people who study all the data in the Labour Party and are absolutely across their own internal polling and focus groups and all the rest of it, even they, I think, to some extent question as to whether it can really be true. They kind of think, can we actually win? The Conservative Party have won so many times over the last 14 years. Have we lost what it takes to get us over the line? So even if their heads were telling them all the numbers stack up, we're going to win, I'm not sure they really believed it in their hearts until last night.
And as for the Conservatives, I mean, really a terrible, terrible night for them. So many big names have gone. A lot of it started with Partygate, which is a story that I think you were the first in breaking, weren't you? You got it. You didn't realise the size of the story when you first saw it, did you?
No, I mean, it was one of a series of stories that we did when I was at the Daily Mirror over a period of time. But I remember writing that first story and thinking, because we'd previously written the story about Barnard Castle and Dominic Cummings going there and breaking lockdown rules. And what I learned from that is actually people felt it very, very strongly when those who were in power and were imposing rules on everyone else which they expected them to abide by didn't then follow those rules themselves, and that had incredible cut-through. So while, of course, I didn't realise what damage that would do to Boris Johnson's reputation, ultimately the Conservatives' poll rating, and sending him on this downward trajectory, I did know that it would have an impact with our readers, with the public, and that would inevitably mean that it was more than just one story that could be forgotten about the next day.
But it was Partygate and then the mini-budget, wasn't it?
Two
Those
things.
two, when you look at the polls, and after the mini-budget, they just never recovered.
No, because because essentially the Conservatives, their reputation for any sort of integrity standards, ethics and so on, I mean, it wasn't just Partygate, right? There was lots of reasons why Boris Johnson's standards regime, if you like, was considered a bit more flexible than others. There was other scandals that surrounded him, but Partygate became the one that people really remembered. So the reputation for integrity took a fatal blow over that, and then the reputation for economic competence took a huge blow over the Liz Truss money budget, and ultimately with those two things, those two factors gone, they were so integral to the Conservative Party brand that there was no bouncing back from that.
What happens to the Conservatives now?
Well, I think in the short term, there will be an almighty struggle for the future of the soul of the party. And we're already seeing it playing out. We've already seen it before the election even took place. Some of the leading candidates making it clear that they were interested in thinking about the direction of the party. Of course, some of those who we were expecting to run, for people like Penny Mordaunt and Grant Shapps, have gone, so they'll no longer be in the running. But I think we'll see a contest where there's a battle on the right of the party, Kemi Badenoch, Robert Jenrick, Priti Patel to be the candidate for that bit of the party, and then you see a similar battle on the sort of the One Nation centrist wing amongst people like Tom Tugendhat, Vicky Atkins, the former Health Secretary, and then the two of them will go to MPs. And what's going to be really interesting is which two they send to the party, because what we've seen time after time after time in Conservative leadership contests is that the party membership is further to the right than the party in this place, and they inevitably pitch for the candidate who's further to the right.
What about Nigel Farage?
Yeah. Well, Nigel Farage a few weeks ago said he wanted to stage a reverse takeover of the Conservative Party in Parliament. Now, I think he'll struggle to do that with just 4 MPs, but as we've already seen today, he likes making himself be heard, and he will not be quiet in that place. He'll be standing up there, asking questions, causing trouble, pointing the finger, attacking the system as well, as Nick has already mentioned.
Which he did in the European Parliament,
which he's already done in the European Parliament. Whether the people of Clacton get much service from their local MP, I think we'll have to wait and see. But the rise of the...
Hilary Benn just looking very leisurely, going up Downing Street with his rucksack on to find out what job he's got.
Well, he, of course, is one of the few that has been in Cabinet before. There was a small number of them, Yvette Cooper and others as well, who've been around that Cabinet table before. He's making a return there, a very experienced politician. But I think one of the challenges that Labour will have, and I've spoken to senior strategists about this already, and in fact Keir Starmer himself, is about how they deal with the rise of the populist right. Because, of course, this is not a phenomenon which is just happening in the UK. We're seeing it very evidently across the Channel in France. We're likely to see nothing but it over the coming months across the Atlantic in the States. And I think Starmer's response to it so far is to try and deliver meaningful change to people, so small ways that they can very quickly see that their lives have been considered and also impacted on by what's going on at Westminster, so that they don't then, in his view, go to a party which is there really to as a sort of like a funnel for all the discontent with mainstream politics.
Do you think we're going to see anything radical? I mean, anything next week? We were talking earlier about the fact that in 1997, Gordon Brown, or I think it was 4 days after the election, suddenly the Bank of England was independent. Nobody was expecting that. It wasn't in the manifesto.
So one thing we've seen from the Labour Party all the way through the campaign, and even before the election campaign was called, was that they will do what they say they will do, and that they won't do what they haven't said that they're going to do. And by that I mean is, we have asked countless times whether we can expect a big Bank of England style moment and been told no, that's not on the cards. They very much believe that the public don't want to hear big promises for politicians that they're then unable to deliver on. They think it's much more important that they say, here's a few tangible issues that we're going to get to grips with and actually deliver on them. So no, we're not expecting a big announcement. What we are expecting is them to go for growth very, very quickly, like within days. I think we'll hear announcements on things like planning and housing and other ways that they can start trying to boost growth, because they've got a really big ambition there. They want to be the highest sustainable growth in the G7. I mean, whether they can meet that, of course, is another matter. And all their other longer-term transformative plans for things like climate and the NHS are all hinged on that. So I think we'll hear from them about growth. We'll also hear from them about foreign policy, not often talked about during general election campaigns. But Keir Starmer, as our new Prime Minister, will be off to NATO in Washington next week, where potentially, I mean, he'll be meeting Zelensky and all sorts of other world leaders, but he will also potentially have his first bilateral meeting with Joe Biden in the United States. So I think we'll be very interested in seeing how all that plays out as well.
But we're seeing today these new members of the government going up Downing Street, all smiles, day one, shiny bags, like the beginning of term, isn't it, at school? Are they going to work as a team in government? Because that's going to present new challenges to relationships and friendships that they've not known before. You know them well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that they have going for them is that the plan, and I think this has been borne out by the appointments that have already been announced, is the plan is to move the shadow cabinet, who have already been working together for a couple of years, wholesale into their positions in government, so that they'll be in the same roles. They've obviously got experience of those policy briefs, and they've got experience of where there's crossover. So, for example, things like Yvette Cooper in the Home Office dealing very closely with Shabana Mahmood in Justice, with one of the biggest crises, one of the biggest, most pressing issues going to be in both of their inboxes is the impact of overcrowded prisons and the criminal justice system. You can imagine them working quite closely together on that. So they've already got the experience of working closely together. And also, secondary to that, while Keir Starmer is not expected, or rather he's told us he isn't going to come in and do what we call machinery government changes, ripping up government departments, renaming them, merging them, separating them, because that takes up too much time and energy, and really they're very, it's sort of an urgent need to get ahead as fast as they possibly can with their plans. He is going to set up what they're calling mission boards. Labour's got these 5 big missions in different policy areas they want to deliver on. They sound a bit like, to me, to like the existing cabinet committees that already exist, where they'll have people from the different relevant departments to deliver, because lots of them are cross-departmental, to deliver. They will have a lead who, in some cases, I think will be somebody external, maybe from business or public life, brought in, someone like Dame Louise Casey's name has been mentioned, for example, to lead on those. And there'll be civil servants, and there's Yvette Cooper wandering now, I think, from Downing Street through the Foreign Office, probably on her way to the Home Office for her new job. You think, who's that walking up the street there?
Steve Reed.
Steve Reed, the likely to be Environment Secretary if he gets the same job as well.
Very close to Keir Starmer, was on his campaign for the leadership way back in 2019.
He was very close to Morgan McSweeney, who of course was the campaign director, who has been who's one of those, along with Pat McFadden and others, who is like the mastermind of this attempt to make Labour's vote as efficient as possible. So even though, as Nick was talking about earlier, their overall vote share and their overall vote is lower than in some previous elections where they haven't won, it's rather than it's mounting up in big cities where they've got huge amounts of support, it's more evenly spread across the country, so they end up winning more seats.
Thank you. Well, now, throughout this campaign, we've been doing your voice, your vote, and getting questions from you, and we've had more that have been sent in today, which you're going to very kindly answer for us, aren't you, Nick? Steve has emailed in asking us, does an MP losing their seat mean that they lose their income, and what do they do next?
Well, you lose your income because you don't have the job anymore, but you do get a payoff, but the level of your payoff depends on whether you stand. So if you stand again and you lose, you get a higher payoff than if you simply resign. But one thing that MPs do have is this very lovely MP's pension, which obviously is related to your years of service, but it is also related to your level of salary, i.e. it's not how much is in the pot, it's how many years you've done. So there you go on that one.
We've got another question here from Hector in Ashby de la Zouche, who says, how different would Westminster look today if proportional representation had been used?
Well, after I saw this question, I had an urgent conversation with the Director General, and he's agreed that we're now going to extend this programme by 10 hours to answer this question.
Not another 10 hours, Nick.
Another 10, or possibly 20, because the question is, what form of PR do you want to have? Let's assume it's sort of the list system, and it's based on reflecting the percentage share of the vote in the House of Commons. And so that would mean that you'd have about 33, 36% of the MPs would be Labour. The interesting nugget is if you added the percentage of the Conservative vote to the Reform vote, that would be higher than the Labour vote, which would go to absolutely what Pippa's saying. Would they want to form a bloc? Suella Braverman would say, marvellous. Jeremy Hunt would say, over my dead body. So essentially, pure PR would mean the seats over there would reflect the percentage shares.
The Dems have always wanted PR, haven't they? But actually this election has worked rather well for them because they've got fewer votes than Reform.
They have always wanted PR, and if they stick to their guns, they're going to join forces with Nigel Farage. And which parts of the country will they campaign for to get PR? It'll be those parts of the country that voted most strongly for Remain. So you could see Ed Davey and Nigel Farage turning up at Cambridge University to get those Remain voters out.
We've got one more question, sorry, from Andrew in Bristol here, which says, is this the lowest turnout in modern British electoral history? Are we seeing the beginnings of a threat towards democracy as a result of voter complacency?
Well, in answer to that question, there's only one person you need to turn to, and that is Paula Surridge, who is one of the great gurus of polling, Peace in the Guardian. She says, on the basis of 648 results out of 650, it's about a 60% turnout. It's a little bit more than the very, very low turnout in 2001. Low turnout is not great because it shows that around about 40% of those eligible to vote don't want to vote, don't feel there's anyone they can support for, and that is low turnout usually sends quite a shockwave through the system.
All these questions go back to one thing, really, don't they? Is that how much of a mandate does Sir Keir Starmer really have? A thumping majority is going to dominate this place, but how much can he say he's got the country behind him?
So it's those two fundamental points. An incredible achievement, I would say a greater personal achievement than Tony Blair, because he's done this in one parliament, not 3 parliaments, 3 leaders, which is what it took in the 1980s, but just over a third of the vote. Reform UK coming a close second in many seats, particularly some Labour seats in Leave voting areas, and that stability in there in terms of the numbers, but potentially instability out in the country with Reform saying we've got so few MPs, yet we got more votes than the Liberal Democrats.
So Sir Keir Starmer is not going to switch off from that fact. I mean, he's seen the vulnerability of the Conservatives go from a big majority to out of office in 4.5 years. He knows that this is a volatile electorate and he could go the same way very quickly.
Yeah, and I think one thing he will have learned, and the people around him will have learned from what happened to Boris Johnson, is that Boris Johnson managed to cobble together, or to pool together, I should say, quite a disparate electoral coalition. People from different ends of the political spectrum. They had certain things which united them. One of them was support for getting Brexit done, as they put it in the 2019 election. Similarly, and that coalition then fell apart over time. Similarly, Keir Starmer has got quite a broad coalition. I wouldn't be surprised when we dig into some of the seats that he's won, whether Labour now represents possibly some of the most pro-immigration seats out there, and also some of the most anti-immigration seats there. And that will be replicated across a whole range of issues. So they have this voter coalition which they're going to have to keep together. They're going to have to find a way of tying people in. And key to that, I think, is going to be delivery. Delivery on things that matter in people's everyday lives, and underlying all of that is the state of the economy. So that will be the absolute priority from day one going forward if they want to stand any chance of holding that coalition together, securing a second term and delivering what Keir Starmer describes as a decade of national renewal.
It's interesting, isn't it? Things like the situation in Bristol, the Greens taking a safe Labour seat on a day when Labour were doing so well, but the Greens, that's another example, Nick, of just how vulnerable all parties are right now.
Vulnerable and pretty fractured. So the seat you're referring to is Bristol Central. Thangham Debonair, I think it was a 29,000 majority last time. She would have been walking up Downing Street to be appointed Culture Secretary. That is not happening. So, you know, that is, for Thangham Debonair, a devastating blow. It would not surprise me if we see Thangham Debonair appointed to the House of Lords and maybe getting some sort of job. I think I can see we've got another appointment coming in.
No, it's Yvette Cooper arriving at the Home Office. There you are.
With Matthew Rycroft, the Permanent Secretary there.
And with huge challenges ahead, of course, migration has been a massive issue during this election campaign. They said they would get rid of the Rwanda scheme on day one. I guess this is day one, isn't it?
They're junking the Rwanda scheme, and their argument, the Keir Starmer argument, is, so Rishi Sunak said, you junk that scheme, you haven't got a plan. Keir Starmer said, no, I have got a plan.
I think we can hear.
The first duty of any government is to keep our country safe, to keep our communities safe, and to keep our borders secure. And so that is why my first task as I go into the Home Office will be Labour's first steps, which means trying to get neighbourhood police back on our streets in our communities, and also setting up the new Border Security Command to go after the criminal boat gangs that are organising the dangerous boat crossings. We know there are a lot of challenges ahead, and after 14 years, there is some difficult legacy that we will inherit, and we know that that will mean hard graft and not gimmicks ahead in order to tackle that. I think what we also know is it feels that our communities have faced damage and often felt fractured and sometimes brittle as well, and our task has to be to bring people back together and to restore respect and to restore trust, as Keir Starmer has said today, to restore politics to public service as well. So thank you, and let the change begin. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yvette Cooper walking into her new home, the Home Office, and Pippa Creer, I mean, the Border Security Command that she mentioned there, that is going to be quite a challenge, particularly what's going on at the moment politically in France.
Yeah, I mean, I think that will be a big worry to them because they've had politically they've been challenged throughout the election campaign, as Rishi Sunak put it, not having a plan. Keir Starmer has been very clear that just because he wants to scrap the Rwanda scheme, which I think ended up sending 4 or 5 people, was it, over eventually, voluntarily as well, at the cost of many, many millions of pounds, that would be scrapped. And that he did have on a plan, but in a very sort of Keir Starmer sense, it's sort of like the Olympic cycling team with their marginal gains, lots of little measures that will mount up to dealing with the bigger problem. So they'll have this more money for the Border Security Command, so more money making sure that they can tackle, they can put money into intelligence to tackle the gangs, the criminal gangs which are bringing people over the channel. But it's all contingent at this point, I think, on a good relationship with the French. They're in a very volatile period, and it looks like potentially you're going to end up with the far right in power, who will have no desire necessarily to help on something like migration when they want actually migrants not even to enter the EU's borders.
Huge change everywhere. Pippa Creer and Nick Watts, thank you both. After hours and hours here in Westminster, it is time for us to leave you. A big thank you to all our teams right across the country who have been with us this morning and this afternoon.
And into the night, Sophie.
Time.
You haven't finished yet. You've got the 6 o'clock news to do. But that is it for us for now. A day of history in British politics. A landslide victory for Labour. They've won 412 seats in the general election, making Sir Keir Starmer our new Prime Minister.
We saw the departure of the former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who apologised following the Conservative Party's general election defeat, the worst in its parliamentary history, with just over 120 MPs remaining. I will be back shortly at 6 o'clock with the BBC News at 6 from Downing Street. But right now, we're going to leave you with a reminder of the key moments in what has been a momentous day.
Bye-bye.
You have given us a clear mandate, and we will use it to deliver change, to restore service and respect to politics, end the era of noisy performance, tread more lightly on your lives, and unite our
country. To the country, I would like to say, first and foremost, I am sorry. I have given this job my all, but you have sent a clear signal that the government of the United Kingdom must change.
We did it!
We can now say with certainty that Labour have won the 2024 general election.
The Conservative Party has taken a battering because it failed to honour the trust that people have placed in it.
Believe me, folks, this is just the first step of something that is going to stun all of you.